Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever had a moment when you realize that you've stepped into something wrong? That feeling when everything around you seems normal at first, but then, little by little, things start to shift and twist in ways you can't explain? That's how it all started for me that night. And trust me, I wish I could have walked away then, before I knew how far gone things would get. It was late, so late that the streets were empty, the city was quiet, and the cold air carried a sharp bite to it. I had missed my last bus, the ones that usually ran until midnight, but the night was still young, or at least it felt like it. I stood at the bus stop, staring at the empty road, not sure what I was waiting for, when I heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. A headlight appeared, a dull orange glow cutting through the darkness, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd lucked out. It was a minibus, the kind that people usually take to get home after a long night. The sign on the front was lit up, showing the familiar route number, the one that passed through the town's outskirts. But as it pulled up, I noticed something off. The lights inside were dim, flickering slightly, and the driver's seat was empty. I hesitated for a moment. My instincts told me to walk away, to forget about it and just get a taxi, but my tiredness got the better of me. I needed to get home, and this minibus would get me there. I climbed aboard. The door shut behind me with a soft whoosh, and the smell inside was stale, like something had been locked in here for too long. The seats were occupied, but not by the usual commuters. This was the first thing that felt strange. The passengers were still, too still, as if frozen in place. Not a single one moved or acknowledged my presence. I made my way down the aisle, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the passengers' faces. They were all staring straight ahead, blank expressions on their faces, their bodies stiff and rigid. It felt like I was walking through a room of mannequins, except these mannequins weren't lifeless. I sat down near the back, trying to shake off the strange sense of discomfort crawling up my spine. It had to be my tiredness messing with me. That's all. The engine sputtered to life, and the bus lurched forward, driving away from the stop. It didn't take long for the familiar roads to fade into unfamiliar ones. The minibus wasn't following the usual route. We passed the usual intersections, the familiar landmarks I'd known for years, and then everything started to change. The streets grew narrower, the buildings taller, and the surroundings darker. The further we went, the less I recognized the place. It was like we were driving into a part of town that didn't exist. I looked around at the other passengers, hoping someone would show signs of life, just a twitch, a sigh, a glance, but they didn't. Suddenly, I felt it, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The hum of the engine was the only sound, but even that seemed distant, muffled, like it was coming from somewhere else. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Every moment felt like we were moving further and further away from the world I knew. I reached for the emergency stop button, but before my fingers could even touch it, I froze. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The driver hadn't moved a single inch, and the route we were on didn't seem like it was going anywhere familiar. I stood up, but the others didn't. Not a single passenger turned to look at me, not even a twitch of their eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I made my way to the front, cautiously approaching the driver's seat. It was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind raced. How was it possible? There had been a driver when I got on. Hadn't there? I couldn't remember. The bus was still moving, but there was no one at the wheel. The thought hit me with a sudden, gut-wrenching realization we were driving into nowhere. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way to stop the bus. The windows were fogged up, the door locked, and the more I tried to pull it open, the more I realized it wouldn't budge. I glanced over at the other passengers again. Still, not a single one moved. I turned back toward the front, my hands trembling. It wasn't just the empty driver's seat anymore. It was the realization that something wasn't right, something was wrong with this bus, with these people, and with this road that seemed to stretch on forever, leading us further away from everything familiar. My heart raced. The unease in my stomach grew. And then I heard it. A sound so soft, so faint, that at first, I wasn't sure it was real. Whispering. It was coming from somewhere. I couldn't tell where. The passengers still weren't moving, but the whispers, they were growing louder. Closer. I needed to get out. I had to get out. But the doors wouldn't open, the driver wasn't there, and I realized this wasn't just a bus ride. It was a nightmare. And I didn't know how to wake up. The whispering grew louder. It was a soft murmur, but it didn't feel like it was coming from any of the passengers. It felt distant, as though it was echoing off the walls of the bus, coming from all directions at once. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and a cold sweat began to form on my forehead. My legs trembled as I stood there, frozen in place. I took a step back, but it didn't feel like I was moving. The bus didn't feel like it was moving either. It was as though we were trapped in some kind of suspended time where nothing changed, but everything felt off. The shadows inside the bus were lengthening, stretching unnaturally. I glanced out the window, trying to find something familiar, but all I could see was an endless stretch of empty road, flanked by towering, featureless buildings. The lights outside seemed to flicker in and out, as though they were struggling to stay lit. I turned back to the passengers. Still no movement. But now, I could see something in their faces that wasn't there before, an emptiness, a hollowness, as though they were vacant. Like their bodies were just shells, waiting for something to fill them. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my mind. I had to think. I had to focus. But every time I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, the whispering grew louder. It was no longer just a murmur. Now it was a chorus, a cacophony of voices blending together into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air around me. I stepped toward the back of the bus again, trying to stay calm, trying to find any sort of logic in this nightmare. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the back of the seat for support, but the sensation of dread was suffocating. The air felt heavy, thick, as if it were pressing in on me, suffocating me with every breath I took. I tried to shake off the feeling, to pull myself together. Maybe this was just a malfunction. Maybe I had fallen asleep on the bus, and this was some strange dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a glitch in the system. This was real. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. It was so sudden that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the bus. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. I stood there in the stillness, my eyes darting around, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt like something was coming. Something worse. Then, as if the silence itself had come to life, a sound broke through. A soft thump, then another, then another. It was coming from the back of the bus. I turned slowly, my body freezing as I tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't like footsteps. It was more like a gentle tapping. But it was coming closer. It was coming from the seats behind me. My breath hitched. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to face whatever was behind me. But I had no choice. I slowly turned my head, my eyes wide with fear. There, sitting in the last row, was a figure. It was a person, but it wasn't quite right. Their head was tilted at an angle, their neck stretched unnaturally long, and their eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. They didn't look human. They looked wrong. The figure was dressed in a tattered coat, and its skin was pale, almost sickly, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years. I froze. My body refused to move, my legs turned to stone. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move except for its eyes, which followed me. It was as if it was waiting, watching, judging. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The whispers returned, but this time they were louder, sharper, as if the voices were right next to me. And the figure, the thing in the back of the bus, it began to smile. Not a human smile. A grin. A twisted, unnerving grin that stretched far too wide, far too far. I had to get off. I had to get out. But the doors wouldn't open. I rushed to the front, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tried the door handle again. Nothing. I pulled and pulled, but it was like the bus was holding me captive. That's when I heard it. A voice. A low, guttural whisper, but this time it wasn't coming from the passengers. It was coming from the figure. You're not leaving. The voice was barely audible, but it pierced through me like a knife. My blood ran cold, and for the first time in my life, I felt real, bone-deep terror. I turned back toward the back of the bus. The figure was still smiling, but now it was standing, slowly moving toward me, its long, unnatural limbs dragging across the floor with a strange, jerky motion. I was trapped. The bus wasn't just taking me somewhere unfamiliar, it was taking me somewhere I didn't want to go. And the worst part? I couldn't remember the way back. The figure was closer now, its grin widening as it continued to approach. I turned away from the door and backed up, but I could feel the presence of the thing behind me. I was being hunted, and I had no idea how to escape. The bus was alive in a way I couldn't understand, and it was driving me toward something. Something that was waiting. The bus jerked forward suddenly, as if it had been waiting for something to happen. I stumbled backward, my body hitting the cold metal wall as the motion threw me off balance. My heart skipped a beat, and I had to steady myself, grasping desperately at the seat beside me. The figure, still grinning, was now inches from me, its face inches away from mine, its eyes wide and unblinking. I could smell it now, an overpowering stench, a mix of old dust and something foul, something rotten. It didn't have a scent that should belong to a person. I didn't know what it was, but the moment it reached out its hand to me, I knew I couldn't touch it. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. My entire body screamed to run, to get away, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by the suffocating dread that clung to the air around me. It whispered again. You can't leave. You belong here. Its voice was raspy, as though it hadn't spoken in years, but the words, they cut through me like a blade. I felt my stomach churn, my throat tightening, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't respond. The fear had paralyzed me. The whispers around me grew louder, more urgent. They swirled through the air, mutating into different voices, some distant, some familiar, some that sounded like people I knew, people I didn't want to remember. They were all saying the same thing: you can't leave. I looked around frantically, searching for any way out. The windows? No, they were dark, impenetrable. The door? Still locked, as though the very mechanism that operated it had decided to stop functioning the moment I needed it most. I turned back to the figure, still standing there, its presence looming over me. Its smile had now stretched even further, its lips cracking at the corners, as if it were forcing itself to grin, to mock me. Its eyes, those horrible, unblinking eyes, never left mine, and every time I tried to look away, I felt its gaze pulling me back, as if it were compelling me. I took a breath, feeling the cold air rush into my lungs, and in that moment of clarity, I knew I had to do something. Anything. I stepped back, my feet moving as if they weren't quite mine, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My eyes flicked to the bus driver, who had been silent and still this whole time, but I didn't dare look too long. There was something wrong with him, too. His posture was too rigid, and his hands gripped the wheel with an unnerving tightness. His face was pale, his eyes glazed over as if he wasn't really in control of what was happening. The bus began to slow down, the sound of the wheels rolling over the asphalt fading into a strange, otherworldly hum. We weren't stopping at a regular stop. We weren't even on a road anymore. It was as though the bus was driving through nothingness. The dark landscape outside had become an endless, empty void, a place where time and space seemed to stretch and bend. The streets had disappeared. The lights were gone. I had to escape. I couldn't stay on this bus any longer. But where would I go? Where was I? The figure inched closer, its fingers extending, long and thin, towards my face. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to reach into my very soul. Suddenly, the bus lurched, and everything went silent. The eerie hum, the whispers, the pounding in my ears, all stopped in an instant. The bus had come to a halt. My eyes widened in disbelief. We were not at a station, not on a road I recognized. We were nowhere. The world outside the bus was an endless void, a black expanse that stretched as far as I could see. And then, the figure spoke, its voice now soft and sweet, almost coaxing. "Get off, if you want to leave." The voice sent a chill straight down my spine. I felt a shiver run through me, but I couldn't stop myself. Something in me told me that getting off the bus was the only way out, but another part of me screamed that it was a trap. It had to be a trap. But the door was now open. I hesitated, my feet glued to the floor. The figure was still there, standing in front of the door, watching me with its cold, unblinking eyes. It didn't speak again, but I could feel its presence pushing me, urging me to step off the bus and into the darkness. I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had, and I stepped off the bus. The ground beneath me felt wrong, soft, unstable. I looked down, expecting to see pavement or grass or dirt, but instead, I saw nothing. It was as if I was standing on the edge of the world, with the bus behind me, disappearing into the void. I turned back to see the bus, the figure still standing by the door. The door slowly closed, and as it did, I felt something shift in the air. A heavy, oppressive weight seemed to settle around me. The bus and the figure were gone, but I was still here, alone, in this place. A place that wasn't supposed to exist. And then I heard it, the whisper. A voice, soft but unmistakable, coming from nowhere. "You'll never leave." I tried to run, but the ground beneath me was slippery, shifting, as though it didn't want me to move. The sky above me was pitch black, no stars, no moon. Just a thick, suffocating darkness. I had made a terrible mistake, but there was no way back. I stumbled, my legs shaking as the darkness pressed against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The whisper echoed in my head, filling every corner of my mind, making it impossible to focus on anything else. "You'll never leave." The words seemed to follow me, chasing me through the abyss. I took one step forward, and then another, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every time I moved, the ground seemed to shift beneath me, as if the very space around me was changing, contorting to prevent me from going anywhere. I could feel the pull of the void behind me, the lingering presence of the bus, of the thing that had been in the driver's seat, of the figures watching me. The thought of them made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop moving forward. There was nowhere to go but deeper into the nothingness. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. It felt as though my words were swallowed by the darkness, vanishing before they even left my lips. Panic clawed at my chest, my heart thundering in my ears. I felt as though I was losing myself, slipping into something beyond comprehension, somewhere I couldn't understand or fight. And then, suddenly, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead. Just a small flicker, but it was enough to make me stop. It was too far to reach, but in the overwhelming black, it felt like the only chance I had. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the shifting ground. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I felt a strange hope blooming in my chest. Maybe this was the way out. Maybe the light was the answer. But as I got closer, something changed. The light didn't stay steady. It flickered and shifted, like it was moving away from me, pulling me further into the darkness. I ran faster, desperation taking over, but the more I ran, the more the light seemed to stretch out of reach. The sound of my footsteps grew louder, echoing in the void, but there was no one else here. I was utterly alone. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the light stopped. It hung in the air before me, still and cold. There was no warmth, no comfort. Just a flickering, sickly glow. I reached out, my hand trembling, but before I could touch it, the light shifted again, this time with a sound, like something scratching at the air, like nails scraping across glass. I froze, my heart sinking. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The light began to distort, twisting like it was trying to shape itself into something else. A figure emerged from the center of the glow, but it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that stretched unnaturally, far too long to belong to anything alive. Its body was a blur, shifting, flickering like the light around it. The face, if it could even be called that, was a smooth, featureless mask, void of expression, but somehow more terrifying than any human face could ever be. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure's movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment, savoring my fear. It reached out with one elongated hand, fingers twitching, and as it moved closer, I could feel the temperature around me drop. The air turned heavy, thick with an oppressive force that made it harder and harder to breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice betrayed me again. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't do anything. The figure was close now, too close. I could feel its presence surrounding me, suffocating me. It whispered in my ear, a voice like ice scraping against bone. "You don't belong here." Its fingers brushed against my skin, cold and unnatural. The touch sent a jolt of pure terror through me, like the very touch of death itself. I wanted to pull away, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs were frozen in place, my mind screaming in protest, but nothing happened. I was trapped. It leaned in, its breath cold and unnatural against my neck. "You belong to the darkness now." The words sent a shiver through me, like they were carving into my very soul. My eyes blurred with tears, but there was no escape, no way to fight it. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and then disappeared entirely, plunging me back into the suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was silence, total and complete. I was alone again, standing in the empty void with no idea where I was or how I had gotten here. But the whispers remained. They lingered in my mind, voices I couldn't ignore. "You can't leave." And this time, they weren't alone. The faint sound of footsteps reached my ears, slow, deliberate, echoing through the nothingness. My heart skipped a beat. They were getting closer. There was no one else here, except for me, and whatever was coming for me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel my pulse quicken, the anxiety bubbling up inside me like a storm about to break. My feet were still frozen, unwilling to obey my desperate command to run. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, yet my body remained locked in place. It was as though the very air itself was holding me down, rooting me to this godforsaken spot in the abyss. The sound of the footsteps echoed in my ears, getting closer with each passing second. I could hear the faint scrape of something on the ground, like claws dragging across concrete, and I knew that whatever was coming wasn't human. My skin crawled as the darkness around me seemed to close and tire, suffocating me with its weight. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to break free of this nightmare. But nothing changed. The footsteps continued, getting louder, now unmistakably close. They stopped just behind me, and a cold breath, like the chill of death itself, brushed against my neck. I felt its presence, cold and suffocating, closing in on me like a predator. And then, a voice. Not the voice of the thing that had haunted me before, but something else. Something worse. It was a low whisper, but it felt as though it was inside my skull, rattling my very thoughts. "You were never supposed to be here," it hissed. "This place, it changes you. It takes you." I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my body trembling as the voice continued, circling me, digging into the deepest parts of my mind. "You thought you could leave?" I wanted to scream, but the words were caught in my throat, suffocated by terror. The air was thick now, impossible to breathe, as though every inhale drew in more darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The footsteps resumed, pacing around me. Something was circling me, its presence so close that I could feel the heat of it brushing against my skin. It wasn't just the darkness now, something else was there, something that thrived in it. It was feeding off my fear. I opened my eyes, but all I could see was the oppressive blackness, the void that had swallowed everything. Nothing was real. Nothing was solid. I could hear the whispers swirling around me, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. They were everywhere. "You don't get it, do you?" the voice rasped, a sneer in its tone. "This bus, these people, this place, it's all part of the trap. You're just another soul caught in the loop, another lost passenger." A chill ran down my spine, a realization dawning on me, but I couldn't process it. I couldn't comprehend what it meant. I just wanted to escape, to get out of this hellhole. "There's no escape," the voice purred, a cruel, mocking laugh following its words. "You're already one of us. You've been here longer than you think." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I felt my grip on reality slipping. Had I been here before? How long had I been trapped in this endless nightmare? The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, a harsh, guttural voice broke the stillness. "Wake up." I blinked. The words were almost too real. Wake up? Was I still dreaming? Or had I somehow entered something much worse? I opened my eyes, the void still surrounding me, but something was different. The silence seemed to stretch out longer now, as if the world had stopped moving entirely. The air felt colder, sharper. It wasn't just the absence of light anymore. It was the absence of everything. Where am I? I felt a sudden movement in the space around me, a shift, a tremor in the very fabric of the nothingness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Something was wrong, more wrong than I could understand. The footsteps started again, closer, quicker. I turned around, only to find myself facing the minibus. The one I had entered at the beginning. But it wasn't the same bus I remembered. The windows were dark, the lights inside flickering erratically, like the heart of the vehicle had gone dead. The door was wide open, but it led nowhere. The road I had traveled on had vanished, replaced by a barren, desolate wasteland that stretched out into infinity. The driver's seat was empty. I stepped forward instinctively, my body moving of its own accord, drawn to the minibus as though it was calling to me. But the closer I got, the more I felt the chill of the air intensifying, the feeling of dread growing stronger. I stopped just before the open door, my heart racing as I peered inside. The seats were occupied, but not by people. No. The figures that sat in the bus were not human. They were wrong. Distorted, twisted shapes that didn't make sense. Their bodies shifted and flickered, their features a blur of motion that made it impossible to focus. And in the driver's seat, the figure sat still, unmoving, its head tilted slightly, as if waiting for me to understand. I felt the weight of its gaze, even though its eyes were obscured. And then the voice again, clear and cold, echoing from within the bus. "It's your turn." I took a step back, my body trembling uncontrollably. My heart was in my throat, my mind a storm of panic, but I couldn't tear myself away. It was as though the bus was pulling me in, the darkness inside it calling to me, claiming me. And then I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. Firm. Unyielding. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You're already here. And now, you'll never leave." And with that final, chilling message, the door slammed shut. The world went black. I had never left the minibus. It had never been a bus at all. I was still there. forever. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the quiet, forgotten places in the world? Places that were once filled with joy, but now stand empty, as if waiting for something or someone to return? It was a late afternoon when I found it. I was wandering through the park, trying to escape the city's chaos, when I stumbled upon an old playground. I hadn't seen it before, but I wasn't exactly paying attention. The day had been long, and I was tired. I figured it had been here all along, hidden behind the trees and old benches. It seemed out of place, like a relic from another time. The swings creaked in the breeze, moving back and forth, though there was no wind strong enough to make them sway so rhythmically. I paused for a moment, staring at the empty structure, an odd sense of unease crawling up my spine. The sound of the swings, soft and eerie, was the only thing that filled the air. There were no children running around, no parents chatting, just silence. And yet, in that silence, I could almost hear the distant sound of laughter, like faint whispers carried by the wind. I should have turned back. But I didn't. I took a step closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. The closer I got, the more I felt the strange presence around me. The playground looked abandoned. The once bright colors of the slides and the jungle gym had faded to dull, chipped paint. The grass beneath my feet was overgrown, and a few scattered leaves rustled as I walked through the gates. My heart beat faster as I moved deeper into the playground. I saw the merry-go-round, its metal frame rusted but still spinning slowly, as if someone had just left it moments ago. No one was in sight. The laughter I had heard was gone, replaced by an unnerving quiet. I walked past the swings again, my shoes scraping against the dirt, and I noticed something strange. One of the swings stopped swinging. I froze. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, the natural pull of gravity. But something inside me resisted that explanation. The swing had been moving on its own, just like the others. Now it hung still, as if waiting. I looked around. There was no one. Yet the air felt heavier, thick, almost suffocating. I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I moved toward the sandbox, half expecting to see something out of place. Maybe a forgotten toy, a doll's hand sticking out from beneath the sand. Instead, I saw only the faintest movement, something shifting just at the edge of my vision. It was like a shadow darting between the playground equipment. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I laughed to myself, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I had to be imagining things. I was tired, overworked, and maybe a little too sensitive to the eerie sounds of the place. Yet, as I stood there, trying to rationalize it, the faint laughter returned. It was quieter this time, almost a giggle, but not from a child. It was something else. I took a step back. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, tall and looming, behind the slide. At first, I thought it was just the trees, the way their branches cast dark shapes across the ground. But no! It moved. Slowly, deliberately. Not a trick of the light, but something real. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. I ran. The sound of my shoes pounding against the dirt, the rustling of the leaves, the creaking of the swings, it all blurred together. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. But as I ran, I could still hear the laughter. It followed me. I didn't stop until I reached the park entrance, breathless and wide-eyed. I glanced back once more. The playground was empty, quiet, like nothing had happened at all. But something had. And I knew, deep down, I had just touched something dark. I couldn't shake the feeling. The playground haunted my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow flickering between the structures just beyond my reach. The laughter still echoed in my mind, faint, unsettling. The next day, I decided to go back. I don't know why I felt compelled to return. Maybe it was the lingering sense of something left unfinished, or perhaps it was the need to prove to myself that what I saw, or thought I saw, was nothing more than a trick of the mind. I arrived at the park just before sunset. The light was soft, casting long shadows across the ground. The air had that cool crispness, typical of late autumn. When I approached the playground, it was eerily quiet. No laughter, no movement, just the gentle swaying of the swings. I stood at the entrance, staring at the slide where I had seen the shadow of the day before. It seemed normal now, ordinary. But something about the stillness made me uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again. The playground looked abandoned, but I knew better now. Something was waiting. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. This time, I moved slowly, carefully, looking for any sign of life. There was none. Not even an animal scurrying in the underbrush. But then I heard it. A soft sound, like a whisper on the wind. A child's voice. I spun around, but there was no one. The playground was empty. Still. The sound came again. This time it was clearer, a giggle, like a child playing, echoing from behind the jungle gym. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't. I walked toward the sound, my heart pounding, each step heavier than the last. I reached the jungle gym and stopped. My breath caught in my throat. There was something there, just at the edge of the slide. A figure, hunched down, as if hiding. It wasn't a person, though. It was wrong. The figure shifted, and I could see more clearly now, pale skin, too thin, limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze. The thing didn't move at first. It just sat there, still, its unnatural presence weighing on the air around it. Then, as if sensing my fear, it began to slowly rise. My pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. As it came into the light, I saw its face, or rather, what was left of it. Hollow eyes stared back at me, dark and empty. The mouth was a jagged line, like something had been carved into its flesh. It smiled, but the smile was wrong. It wasn't a smile of joy or innocence, it was the twisted grin of something that should not exist. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat. It slowly, deliberately, extended a hand toward me. Suddenly, a loud creaking noise pierced the silence, followed by the sound of a swing violently swinging back and forth. The figure paused, its head tilting unnaturally, as if listening to the movement. I took a step back, my legs finally responding. I didn't know what was happening or why, but I knew one thing: I had to leave. I spun around and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was closing in on me. As I passed through the gates, I looked over my shoulder. The playground was once again still, silent. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel that presence, watching, waiting. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon, but I wasn't going back to that place again. Not unless I had no choice. There were things in this world that shouldn't be disturbed. And I had just learned that lesson the hard way. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the playground. Each night, the images of the twisted figure and the sound of that haunting laughter replayed in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong with that place. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it seemed to call me back. It had been a week since my last visit, but the unsettling feeling hadn't faded. In fact, it had only grown stronger. I had to know more. I had to understand what that thing was, why it had been there, and why it seemed so connected to the playground. I started asking around. I went to the local library, searching through old newspaper clippings. The park, it seemed, had a history, one that no one wanted to talk about. There were stories of children who had vanished over the years, all near the same playground. At first, the disappearances had been chalked up to accidents or runaway children. But then, as time passed, the stories grew stranger. Parents reported hearing their children laughing when no one was there. Strange shadows appeared in the playground at night, moving when there was no wind. One story stood out above the rest, a report of a fire. Years ago, there had been an accident in the park. A fire had broken out in the small building next to the playground, where maintenance equipment was stored. A few children had been playing nearby when the fire started, but none of them had been found. Their bodies were never recovered. The article didn't go into much detail, but there was one line that caught my attention. Some say the souls of the lost children still linger in the park, seeking to return to the place they once loved. That sent a chill down my spine. It was clear now that the playground wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. Or at least, that's what it felt like. The laughter I had heard, the presence I felt, it all made sense. The souls of those children, trapped in the place they had once found joy, had never truly left. I couldn't let it go. I had to go back again. This time, I needed to understand what had happened. I needed to see for myself. That evening, as the sun began to set, I made my way back to the park. I felt a mixture of dread and curiosity stirring in me. What would I find this time? The playground looked the same as before, empty, quiet, almost inviting. But the air was thick, like something was waiting, lurking beneath the surface. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The swings were still, the merry-go-round motionless. But this time, there was no laughter, no shadows. The place seemed completely abandoned. I walked toward the slide again, the one where I had seen the figure. I paused, staring at it, half expecting to see something move. Nothing. Then I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like the rustle of wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Help us." I froze. The voice sounded young, like a child's, but there was something wrong with it, something hollow. The sound seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me, echoing in my ears. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow. Only the empty playground. But then I saw it, a faint flicker, just beyond the jungle gym. Something moving in the shadows. It was too quick to be real, but I couldn't ignore it. The voices grew louder, now coming from all around me. Play with us, come back. My breath quickened. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to hear these voices anymore. But my feet wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me there, forcing me to listen, forcing me to watch. I turned back to the slide, and for a moment, I thought I saw something standing there, something small, hunched down, hiding in the shadows. It was a figure, like the one I had seen before, but this time it was different. It wasn't twisted or unnatural. It was a child. A pale, ghostly figure of a child, no older than 5 or 6, its eyes wide and hollow, staring directly at me. I could feel my chest tightening, my body trembling. I wanted to run, to get away from this place, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The child began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps silent on the ground. The closer it got, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't understand. And then it spoke. We never left. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the swings. The swing that had been still all evening shot forward, creaking loudly as if pushed by invisible hands. The merry-go-round started turning. Faster and faster, its metal groaning under the pressure. The child reached out toward me, its hand cold and pale, fingers twitching with unnatural motion. I could feel its gaze burning into me, demanding that I come closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The sounds of the playground filled my ears, creaking, laughing, whispering, as if the entire park was alive, watching me, chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance, my legs aching from the effort. I glanced back once more. The playground was silent. Empty. But I knew what I had seen. The spirits of the lost children were still there, waiting for someone to join them. Waiting for someone to never leave. I couldn't stop shaking. Even after I left the park, even when I was miles away, I still felt the cold grip of fear around my chest. The child's face, hollow and desperate, haunted me. The whispers, the creaking swings, the laughter, all of it had followed me, like a shadow, and I could still hear it in the back of my mind. I tried to push it away. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The park wasn't just haunted by memories, it was alive, and it wanted something from me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out what that place wanted, what it was hiding. The next day, I went to the local history center. I figured the library's old newspapers hadn't given me enough, so I needed to dig deeper. I started talking to the staff, asking questions about the park, its history, the fire, the disappearances. The elderly woman behind the counter, Miss Thompson, looked at me with an odd expression when I mentioned the park. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned closer to me, as if afraid to be overheard. "You're interested in the old playground, huh?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. I nodded, my throat dry. "I wouldn't go near it if I were you," she said, shaking her head slowly. "There's a story there that hasn't been told. Not properly, at least. People don't like to talk about it. Too many strange things happened. And not just to the children, but to anyone who spent too long there." I leaned in, urging her to continue. "What happened?" She glanced around nervously, then lowered her voice. "It's said that the fire was no accident. Some of the children didn't just vanish, they were taken by something not of this world. Some of them say the park itself did it. That it was hungry, that it needed them to keep its curse alive. I frowned, unsure if I was hearing the truth or just old gossip. The park, what does that even mean? Miss Thompson sighed. There was an old man who used to live near the park. He was a caretaker of sorts. No one paid him much attention, but some say he knew what was going on. Before the fire, he was seen walking around the park at night, muttering to himself. The children loved him. He'd tell them stories, play with them in the evenings. But then, one night, he just disappeared. And after that, things started happening. The laughter you hear, the whispers, some believe he's still there. Still trying to protect the children from whatever is watching. Her voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But there are others who think that the old man wasn't the protector at all. That he was part of the reason the park is cursed. That he was trying to bring something back, something dark. I felt the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they were more terrifying than I could have imagined. The old man. The lost children. The haunting laughter. It wasn't just a place of forgotten joy, it was a place of suffering, of trapped souls, and dark forces. I thanked Miss Thompson and left, but the gnawing feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I had to go back. I had to confront whatever was in that park, whatever was holding onto those lost souls. That night, I made my decision. I would return to the playground one last time. I had to end this. The park was quiet when I arrived, just like the last time. The sky above was dark, heavy with clouds. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This time, I wasn't just going to be a witness to the terror. This time, I was going to find answers. I walked slowly through the gates, the creaking of the swing setting my nerves on edge. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the rustling of leaves in the distance. But beneath that, there was something else. Something faint but familiar. Laughter. The same haunting sound I had heard before. I moved toward the source, my heart pounding louder with each step. As I approached the slide again, I saw it, the shadow. But this time, it wasn't just a fleeting shape. It was a figure. Tall, twisted, but not entirely human. The thing turned toward me. Its face was gaunt, its eyes hollow. I could hear its breath, ragged and shallow, as it stepped closer. It wasn't the child. It was something worse. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 broken echoes. "You can't leave." I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt frozen, my feet stuck to the ground. I couldn't escape. "We never leave," the figure continued. "We're all here. Trapped. Forever." And then the laughter returned. Louder. Closer. All around me. It was no longer just the sound of children, it was a chorus, a scream that filled the air. The figure lunged toward me, its long, skeletal arms reaching out. I screamed. And then everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air as though I had been submerged underwater. The ground beneath me was hard and cold, and I could feel the sharp blades of grass poking through the fabric of my clothes. My head ached as I slowly pushed myself up, blinking in the dim light. The park was still there, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick, the sky had taken on an unnatural gray hue, and the sounds of the world seemed muted. For a moment, I didn't know if I had been dreaming or if I had truly experienced what had just happened. But the sensation of cold fingers still lingered on my skin, and I could still hear the laughter, the relentless, echoing laughter of children as if they were all around me. I stood shakily, my body trembling, and looked around. The playground was as empty as before, but I could feel eyes on me, like something was watching, waiting. The swings swayed gently, creaking as though the wind had pushed them. But the wind hadn't been there. There was no breeze. The figure, the one that had attacked me, was gone. But the feeling it left behind, that presence, was still suffocating the air around me. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever I had seen in that park, it wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't a simple haunting. It was something far darker. Something that fed on fear. And it was alive. I stumbled toward the gate, each step heavy, like my feet were being weighed down by something unseen. I wasn't sure how I had gotten here or how I would leave, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't let those things, take me. As I reached the gate, I heard a noise behind me. It was a soft shuffle at first, barely audible over the whispers that filled the air. But then, a child's voice broke through the silence. "Don't go." I whipped around, heart racing. There, standing near the jungle gym, was the figure of a child. It was small, just like the one I had seen before, but its eyes were wide open, too wide. It smiled at me, but it wasn't a smile of innocence. It was a smile of hunger. "We need you. Stay with us." The words felt like they were being driven into my skull, each syllable a hammer strike to my mind. I took a step back, then another and another, until I was standing outside the gates, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure of the child was still there, but it was fading, the edges of its body blurring like smoke. It was almost as if the park itself was trying to pull it back. Or perhaps it was trying to pull me back. I didn't care. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, my legs aching, my chest tight with the force of my panic. The sounds of the park, the laughter, the whispers, pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I drove as fast as I could, never once glancing in the rearview mirror. The park grew smaller and smaller in the distance, but the feeling didn't leave me. The laughter still echoed in my ears, and I could feel the eyes of those children watching me. When I finally reached home, I locked the doors and sat in the darkness, too terrified to turn on the lights. I didn't know if I had escaped the park or if it had let me go. But I knew one thing for sure. I had been marked. The voices hadn't stopped. They never would. And the park, the cursed playground, would always be there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to step inside. I would never be the same. And neither would anyone else who went looking for answers. Have you ever thought about fate? That feeling that no matter what you do, some things are simply meant to happen? I never believed in it until the day I found the diary. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had taken a detour to the old library while waiting for an appointment. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just the quiet, the scent of old books, the faint rustle of pages turning as I passed by rows of forgotten knowledge. But then I saw it. It was tucked away on the highest shelf, in the farthest corner of the library, where the light barely reached. A leather-bound book. Its edges were frayed, the cover cracked, but it looked oddly out of place. It wasn't like the other books on the shelf. Something about it called to me. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached up, carefully pulling it from the shelf, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The book was thick, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, expecting to find something ancient and forgotten. Instead, the first page startled me. The handwriting was familiar. It was mine. I stared at the page, heart racing, as I read the words. The first entry was dated, today's date. The ink was fresh, as if it had just been written. My name, the time, even the weather outside, all described in detail. But what chilled me to the bone was the next line. He would find the diary today. He would read the words, and everything would change, but not in the way he hoped. My hands trembled. The words seemed to speak directly to me, describing my exact actions, as though this moment had already happened, as if someone or something had already seen it. I turned the page. The next entry was about my life, things that I hadn't told anyone, small details that only I knew. How was this possible? Who could have written this? My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages, each one more detailed than the last, recounting moments I had yet to experience. There were descriptions of things I hadn't even thought of yet, but they were written as if they had already happened. Every entry felt like a snapshot of my life, but not in the past. In the future. And then I found it. The last entry. The end will come tonight. He will try to stop it, but it will already be too late. The door is open, and nothing can close it now. I froze. The words were written in a rush, the ink smeared slightly as if the writer had been in a hurry. I stared at it, my mind racing. What did it mean? What door? What end? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow triggered something by opening the book. It was as if the moment I started reading, I had set something in motion, something inevitable. I closed the diary, my mind reeling. I needed to leave the library. I needed to get out of there before whatever was coming, whatever had already been written, caught up with me. But as I turned to leave, something stopped me. A sound. A faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from the pages themselves. You can't escape what's already been written. I spun around, but the library was silent. No one was there. The whisper was gone, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The diary. The whisper. The eerie feeling that something unseen was pulling at the threads of my life. I left the library, but the air felt different now, heavier. The streets were the same, but they didn't feel familiar anymore. It was as if I was seeing everything through a fog, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly and I was no longer quite in control of it. At home, I placed the diary on my desk, staring at it as it lay there, still and silent. It was tempting to open it again, to see what would happen next. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I had already seen too much. I tried to go about my day as usual. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and worked. But my mind kept drifting back to that final entry, the end will come tonight. What end? What was it talking about? The thought gnawed at me, and as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the sense of urgency. Something terrible was coming, and I had no idea how to stop it. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, it started. I received a call from my friend, Adam. His voice sounded distant, as if something was wrong, even though he tried to sound normal. "Hey, you busy tonight?" he asked. I paused, sensing that something was off. "No, why?" I don't know, man. Just, There's something I need to tell you. Something's not right. You should probably come over tonight. It's important. I felt a coldness spread through me. Adam's usual tone of easygoing confidence was gone. He sounded like he was afraid. Is everything okay? I asked, my voice tight. I don't know. I just think you need to be here, he said, and then abruptly hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone. His words echoed in my mind. I needed to be there. I needed to be there tonight. That was when the thought struck me. Could this be it? The end? Was Adam in danger? Had the diary predicted this? I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my jacket, snatched the diary from my desk, and rushed out of the apartment. The streets were darker now, the sun setting quickly. It felt like the world was moving too fast. As I walked toward Adam's house, every step seemed heavier. The air around me grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The whispering in my mind started again, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It's too late. It's already begun. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach Adam before whatever was coming arrived. But as I neared his house, something felt wrong. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, wavering shadows on the ground. I could see Adam's house in the distance, its windows dark. But there was something else. A figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the pool of light. I froze. The figure was tall, too tall. It was standing perfectly still, unmoving, but its presence felt like a weight pressing down on me. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the figure. It was me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the other me, my face, but somehow wrong. His eyes were black, deep voids, and his mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. You can't escape, it whispered. Suddenly, I heard the door to Adam's house creak open. I turned, desperate to reach him, but as I did, I saw something in the window. A shadow moving inside. Then I heard it. A loud, gut-wrenching scream. No! I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the night. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding, but as I stepped onto the porch, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I tried to open it, but the handle was cold and unyielding. The darkness around me seemed to close in, and I could feel the eyes of the figure behind me. It's too late, it whispered again. You've already sealed his fate. I turned around to confront the thing, but it was gone. The figure, the shadow, it had disappeared. Only the quiet remained. But I knew it wasn't over. Adam was inside, and whatever that thing was, whatever the diary had warned me about, it wasn't finished yet. I slammed my fist against the door, the wood creaking under the force of my frustration. Adam's scream still echoed in my mind, distant but clear. I couldn't let him face whatever that thing was, whatever I had become. I stepped back from the door, my breath shallow and quick. The air felt charged, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. The weight of everything, the diary, the whispering, the figure, was pressing down on me, and I knew that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. I tried the door again, but the handle refused to turn. It was locked. I looked around, desperate for some way in, when I spotted a small window on the side of the house. It was cracked open just enough for me to slip through. Without a second thought, I moved toward it, my hands trembling as I climbed up to the sill. I pushed the window open and crawled inside, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The last thing I needed was to alert whatever was inside. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and narrow, with shadows that seemed to move on their own. The walls were lined with old pictures, their faces all staring at me, their eyes lifeless. I called out quietly, "Adam?" No answer. The silence seemed to grow thicker. I crept through the house, each room colder than the last, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel it now, the presence, like a shadow lurking just behind me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I wasn't alone. It was there, watching me. I reached the living room, where the scream had come from. The door was ajar, and the dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the space. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room, searching for Adam. The room was empty. Nothing but a few scattered books on the floor and a chair knocked over in the corner. Where is he? I turned to leave, but then I saw it. A small piece of paper folded neatly on the coffee table. I picked it up, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. It was a note, written in my handwriting. "You can't change what's coming. It's already been decided." I felt a chill run through me. The note was dated tonight's date. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even been here. Then it hit me. This wasn't the first time. I looked around, my eyes darting from corner to corner. The room seemed to warp before me, the walls closing in as I remembered something else. Something important. The diary. I had read it, hadn't I? But if it was right, if the future had already been written, then maybe this was all part of it. Maybe I was stuck in some kind of loop, destined to experience the same thing over and over again. I heard a noise behind me. A soft shuffle, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. My body froze. I slowly turned around. There, in the doorway, was Adam. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. And then I saw it. The figure. It stood just behind Adam, its tall, distorted shape almost blending into the shadows. Its eyes were empty, black pits, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "It's too late," it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Adam turned to look at the thing, but when he saw it, his expression twisted in horror. His mouth opened, but he couldn't make a sound. "Run!" I shouted, rushing toward him. But it was already too late. The figure lunged at Adam, its arms stretching far too long, wrapping around him like a net. Adam's body went limp in its grasp, his face frozen in terror. I tried to reach him, but the thing moved with a speed that defied logic, vanishing into the darkness with Adam in its arms. And then it was silent again. I stood there, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty once more. I turned around slowly, the weight of the moment crashing down on me. The note on the table, the one I had just read, was gone. The room was exactly as it had been before. The chair, the books on the floor. Nothing had changed. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Had it happened? Had any of this really happened? Or was I stuck in some sort of nightmare, destined to relive the same moment over and over again? I looked around, my gaze landing on the door. The door that had slammed shut behind me when I tried to leave. It wasn't closed anymore. It was open. And I knew what that meant. The door was wide open now, and I stood frozen in the living room, staring at it. For a moment, I couldn't decide whether to go through it or stay where I was, trapped in the house of nightmares that had become my reality. The coldness, the whispers, the sense that nothing was truly real anymore, it all blended together into a suffocating fog. And then, in the back of my mind, I heard it again, the voice from the diary. You can't escape what's already been written. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It felt like a command. And despite my better judgment, despite the fear that gripped my every nerve, I couldn't stop myself from walking toward the open door. With each step, the weight of inevitability settled deeper into my chest. I had already read the diary. I had seen what was coming. I couldn't undo it. But maybe there was still a way to change it. Maybe if I understood more, if I knew more about what was going to happen, I could find some way to stop it. I stepped out onto the porch, the night air biting into my skin. The sky above was clouded over, dark and thick with tension, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. I could hear nothing but my own breath, ragged and uneven. The world was eerily quiet, except for that low hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like the calm before a storm. I moved down the steps, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the yard, just like before. Tall, distorted, with its black eyes and wide, jagged grin. But this time, something was different. This time, I could see it more clearly, like the fog around me had lifted just enough to reveal the thing in full. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. You shouldn't have come, the thing whispered, its voice slithering through the air. I froze. I knew it wasn't real, not in the way I understood reality. It couldn't be. I had seen it before, or had I? My thoughts were slipping through my fingers like sand. The more I tried to hold onto them, the faster they slipped away. I took a step backward, then another. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Every instinct told me to get away, but there was something else, something pulling me toward it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from its dark form, the way it seemed to bend the very air around it. You can't change it. You've already made your choice. The voice was almost like a whisper, but it shook the ground beneath me, vibrating deep within my bones. I staggered back, disoriented, the words spinning around in my head like a cyclone. What do you want from me? I shouted, though I already knew the answer. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an affirmation. I had already given in. The figure began to move, slowly at first, as if savoring each step. Its body twisted unnaturally, limbs extending and retracting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The shadows around it seemed to swirl, becoming thicker, darker. I turned to run, my feet finally obeying me, but the world shifted in an instant. The ground beneath me buckled, the sky seemed to fold over, and I was falling, plunging into a black void. I hit the ground hard. My breath left me in a rush, and I lay there for a moment, gasping for air. But when I looked up, I wasn't in Adam's house anymore. I was back in the library. The same dusty shelves, the same faint light filtering through the windows. The diary was in my hands again, the pages cold under my fingers. I could feel it. This had happened before. The words in the book, the events, the terror, it was all happening again. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't escape it. The whispering began again, this time louder than ever. You can't escape what's already been written. This is where it begins. This is where it ends. I looked down at the diary, my heart pounding in my chest. The page I had last read was gone. In its place was a new entry. And at the top, in bold letters, was a date. Tonight's date. I stared at the words, unable to tear my eyes away. And as I read them, a sickening realization hit me. This wasn't a loop I could break. This was the end. The end that had already been decided. The final entry read, "He will find the diary, and he will try to stop it. But in doing so, he will only bring it closer. The door is open. The darkness has already come." I slammed the book shut, but it didn't help. The air in the library thickened, the shadows in the corners growing darker, deeper. The figure, it was here again. And this time, there was no escape. The figure stepped into the library, its form taller than before, stretching impossibly long as it emerged from the shadows. Its presence seemed to warp the space around it, making the walls of the room feel as though they were closing in. The familiar scent of old books and dust faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread, thick and suffocating. The whispering, which had been so distant before, now filled my ears, a chorus of voices that sounded like a million breaths exhaled in unison. "You can't escape what's been written," it murmured, its voice blending with the noise, making it hard to tell where one voice ended and the other began. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I could barely breathe, the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. The diary in my hands felt cold, like it had come alive with its own dark energy. I tried to throw it, to burn it, to do anything to stop the endless cycle, but no matter how many times I read it, no matter how many times I closed the cover, the ending remained the same. "This is the end," the figure said again, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that it wasn't just speaking to me, it was speaking to everything. It had always been the end. There was no escape, no way out. I had tried to change it, to fight it, but every attempt had only brought me closer to this moment. The past, present, and future had twisted together into one unbreakable thread. And no matter how hard I pulled, it would only snap back to this point. I turned to flee, but the space around me was shifting. The walls of the library blurred, warping into something unrecognizable. The shelves seemed to stretch higher and higher, the books becoming more indistinct, their titles unreadable. I couldn't see the door anymore. The room was closing in on me, becoming smaller, tighter, until I was standing in the center, surrounded by the void of space. The figure was no longer just in front of me, it was everywhere. It loomed above me, beside me, behind me, its eyes staring down with that hollow emptiness. It smiled again, the grin wide and jagged, stretching further than anything human should. "You've already written your story," it said softly, its voice almost pitying. "And now, it's time for the final page." I fell to my knees, my mind spinning. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything. About everyone. The future wasn't something I could change. It had always been set in stone. And I had been a fool to think I could alter it. I felt a presence behind me, a shadow stretching toward me. The book, the diary, was still in my hands, but it had begun to feel heavier, as if it were made of stone. I looked down at it one last time, but the pages had changed. The final entry was different now, and this time I didn't have to read it to know what it said. I could feel it. The weight of everything, every decision, every moment, pushing me toward the same conclusion. The final page was blank. I looked up at the figure, my throat tight. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. There was nothing left to say. The story had already been told. It stepped forward, its hand reaching toward me. I knew what would happen next. It would take me. Not just my body, but my mind, my soul. Everything would fade into nothingness, and I would become just another part of the story. Another forgotten face in the endless cycle of time. And as its fingers brushed against my skin, everything went dark. I was falling again, but this time there was no ground, no sky. Just an endless, all-consuming void. The whispers had stopped. The figure was gone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel something there with me, something that wasn't just a thing. It was everything. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, there was a final flash of light. I woke up. The library was gone. The darkness was gone. I was lying on the cold floor of my apartment, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. My heart was still pounding, my body shaking from the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But it was over. Or so I thought. The diary was beside me on the floor. I reached for it, trembling. The cover was stained with something dark. Something that hadn't been there before. I opened it, feeling my breath catch in my throat. The pages were blank. But as I flipped through them, something caught my eye. A single word, written in the center of the last page. Again. Have you ever heard a song that you couldn't escape from? Not because it's stuck in your head, but because it feels like it's pulling you in, slowly wrapping itself around you, becoming part of your thoughts, your heart, your soul? I heard the melody for the first time on a Tuesday night. It was soft at first, barely audible through the thin walls of my apartment. I was used to the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people in the hallway, the occasional sound of footsteps on the stairs. But this was different. It started as a faint piano tune, no more than a whisper carried on the air. A few notes, barely enough to make out the rhythm. I remember thinking it was strange, but not in a way that made me feel scared. Just curious. Maybe one of my neighbors was playing, though the sound felt odd, as if it was coming from the wrong direction. Not from the apartments beside me, but from the one directly across the hall. The apartment across from mine had been empty for months. The couple who lived there moved out, and no one had replaced them. The door was always locked, and I never heard anything from that side. But the song persisted, filling the quiet of the night. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a song, right? But every night it returned, a little louder, a little clearer, until it was impossible to dismiss. It was beautiful, haunting even, but it had an unsettling quality to it. It wasn't the kind of music you could casually enjoy. It was the kind of music that got under your skin, that gnawed at your thoughts when you weren't even listening to it. I found myself drawn to it, the sound becoming an obsession. I couldn't focus on anything else. Work became harder to concentrate on. I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling, listening intently for the next note, the next phrase. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could almost see the melody swirling in the air like smoke, winding through the room like a thread, pulling me closer to it. The first few nights, I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, the song began to change. The notes weren't just beautiful anymore, they were insistent. Louder. They demanded my attention, like a voice calling out to me in the dark. On the fourth night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got from my bed, a strange compulsion urging me to go toward it. The melody seemed to wrap around me, making the air feel thick and heavy. I stood in front of the door to the empty apartment, my hand on the cold knob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something told me I shouldn't. Something told me I didn't need to. But still, I couldn't stop myself from listening. The sound of the piano was clearer now, almost as if it were inside my own head. I felt it reverberating in my chest, in my bones. I took a step back from the door, my breath quickening, the melody seeming to follow me. It was too much. Too close. I wasn't sure how I knew, but I could feel something watching me from the other side. I tried to shut it out, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the music played louder. It was as if it was inside me, crawling through my thoughts, turning them dark, turning them strange. I could feel the rhythm of it in my veins, pounding like a second heartbeat. I could feel it in my mind, bending my thoughts in ways I couldn't control. I went back to bed that night, but sleep didn't come. The melody kept playing, and it felt like it was moving closer. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was something more. Something dangerous. The next night, the melody was louder, impossible to ignore. It filled the apartment, not just from across the hall, but from everywhere. The air seemed thick with it, like a fog made of sound, wrapping around me, clinging to my skin. I couldn't breathe without hearing it, couldn't think without feeling it. I tried to drown it out with music, turning up the volume on my stereo, but the song was louder still, seeping through every wall, every crack, until it was as if it was coming from inside my own mind. I lay there, frozen, my heart racing, and I realized this was no longer just a melody. It was a presence. A force. It was calling me. I couldn't help myself. I stood up and walked to the door. The melody seemed to guide my steps, pulling me toward it. As I reached for the handle, my hand shook. But I didn't stop. Something in me knew I had to know what was on the other side. The door creaked open, the sound sharp in the silence of the apartment. The hallway outside was dark, the flickering light from the overhead bulb casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The sound of the piano was louder now, clearer. I stepped out into the hall, the music swirling around me like a mist, making it difficult to think, difficult to breathe. I don't know why I felt the need to go in. The apartment was supposed to be empty. No one had lived there for months, but the music, it was coming from inside. I walked toward the door across the hall, my feet moving of their own accord. I felt as though I was being pulled, as though I had no control over my body. I stood in front of the door. It was dark inside, the hallway outside barely offering any light. But there was something about the darkness, something about the way the shadows twisted and shifted that made my skin crawl. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from reaching for the door handle. It opened with a quiet groan, and I stepped inside. The apartment was exactly how I remembered it, empty, untouched by time. Dust covered the floors, and the furniture was still in place, as if frozen in a moment long past. There was a sense of abandonment, of stillness, that made the place feel wrong. And yet, the music played on. The sound came from the far corner of the room, where an old piano sat, its keys moving by themselves, playing the same haunting tune over and over again. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. It was as if the music had taken over my body, filling my senses, taking control of everything. The piano played, and then it stopped. The silence was worse than the music. My heart thudded in my chest, the quiet pressing down on me. I glanced around the room, my eyes searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. And that's why I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a movement out of the corner of my eye. But as I turned my head, I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just beyond the piano. It was dark, its features indistinct, but the feeling of presence was undeniable. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. My body felt frozen in place, my legs unable to move, my mouth unable to scream. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, and yet something inside me screamed to run, to escape, to leave before it was too late. The figure stepped forward, the sound of its footsteps muffled by the thick air. The music started again, softer now, but still there, wrapping itself around me, pulling me in. The figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, becoming part of the room, part of the melody. And then, I heard it, whispers. Soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but growing louder with each passing moment. The whispers were speaking to me, calling me by name, but I couldn't understand the words. The sound was disorienting, overwhelming, and I felt myself slipping away, my mind unraveling in the face of it. The figure moved closer, its form growing clearer, its shape solidifying. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, a woman, standing in front of me. Her face was pale, her hair long and dark, and her eyes were empty. Hollow, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The melody was her voice. It was the only thing she needed. The whispers grew louder, and I felt my body move, my hands reaching out toward her, as if I had no control over myself anymore. My thoughts were drowned out by the music, by the whispers. And then, in that moment, I knew the song wasn't just a melody. It was a trap. I had walked into it. I was already caught. I don't know how long I stood there, my hand outstretched toward the figure, but it felt like an eternity. The whispers had taken over my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind. I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't even remember why I had come here in the first place. The woman's hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking, her face pale and empty. There was no expression on her face, but somehow it felt like she was judging me. Her presence was suffocating, like the air around me had thickened to the point where I couldn't breathe. The melody played on, its notes wrapping around me tighter and tighter, until I couldn't tell where the music ended and I began. I tried to pull my hand back, tried to turn and run, but it was as if the air itself held me in place. My feet wouldn't move. My mind screamed for me to escape, but my body betrayed me. The whispers were louder now, urgent, frantic, like 1,000 voices echoing in the dark, all calling my name, pleading with me to come closer. But I couldn't. I couldn't let myself be consumed by it. I shut my eyes, hoping to block it out, but the music still played in my mind. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it was a constant pressure, a force that pressed against my thoughts, twisting them, distorting them. I felt myself being drawn in, as if the very walls of the apartment were closing in on me, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to drag me deeper into the room. And then, as if something snapped, the figure moved. She stepped forward, her footsteps soundless, gliding toward me with an unnatural smoothness. My body froze in terror, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away from her. I couldn't move. The whispers had become a chorus now, each voice blending with the others, creating a cacophony that filled every inch of my mind. The woman reached out with one hand, her fingers long and slender, as if she was inviting me to take her hand, to let her pull me deeper into the darkness. I could feel her presence in the air, like a cold breeze that brushed against my skin. But there was no warmth in it. No kindness. It was a promise. A promise of something I couldn't understand but feared nonetheless. My hand twitched as if it wanted to reach for her, but I fought against it, fighting with everything I had left. The music grew louder, more insistent. The whispers screamed in my ears, urging me to give in. It felt like they were no longer just coming from the apartment, they were inside my head, inside my soul. And then, I heard it, a sharp, piercing note that cut through the noise, and for a split second, everything stopped. The music. The whispers. The figure. Everything. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, and the room was silent. The woman was gone. The piano had stopped playing. The apartment was empty, just as it had been before. But the silence was worse than the noise. The absence of sound pressed against my ears like a heavy weight. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing made sense. The walls were just walls. The floor, just the floor. The apartment was still empty. Except for one thing. There, on the floor in front of me, was a small, folded piece of paper. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. My name was written on it, in delicate, flowing handwriting. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. I could feel it, deep in my gut, the same way I could feel the music, faintly, but undeniably, tugging at me. It was a warning. The melody wasn't just a song. It was a curse. A curse that would follow me, no matter where I went. A curse that would never let me go. I had walked into the apartment once. I had opened the door. And now I was marked. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that room, listening to the song and the whispers. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The longer I listened, the more the air thickened, like I was drowning in the sound, suffocating under its weight. My mind was slipping, unable to hold on to any sense of reality. The woman with hollow eyes remained motionless in front of me. Her presence filled the room like a dark fog, a force I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried to move. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but they weren't speaking words anymore. They were just sounds, like a chorus of voices, all calling my name. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs felt heavy, my feet rooted to the ground, as if the very floor was pulling me in, holding me in place. The melody echoed in my ears, repeating over and over, each note deeper, darker, until it felt like it was carving its way into my soul. The woman's form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind, and for a brief moment, I saw her face again, those hollow eyes, those dark pits staring right through me. Her lips parted, and she whispered something. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them deep inside, in places I didn't even know existed. The sound of the piano began again, softer this time, but somehow more insistent, as if it were trying to pull me closer. Every note, every chord, wrapped itself around my mind, tightening like a noose. Leave, I tried to say, but the words caught in my throat. The whispers drowned out my voice, and I realized she wasn't the only one in this room anymore. There were others, more figures, emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct at first but slowly becoming clearer. They were all around me now, moving silently, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but listen to the music and the whispers, each one pulling me deeper into the darkness. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, the walls shifting, bending, narrowing, until there was nowhere left to go. I could feel the air growing colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. The figures surrounded me, their eyes fixed on me, their faces twisted in silent agony. I could feel their presence, a heavy pressure in the air, suffocating me, pushing down on my chest. Then the music changed. The melody shifted, and with it came a new feeling, one of unease, of dread. It was no longer beautiful. It was raw, distorted, jagged, as if the piano was being played by someone in pain, someone trapped, unable to escape. The notes bled into each other, creating a discordant, chaotic sound, the kind of noise that made my skin crawl. I could feel the presence of the woman moving closer, her form slowly materializing in front of me. She reached out, her hand cold as ice, and I felt it, the pressure building, the weight of her touch pulling me toward her. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. My throat was dry, my body frozen, unable to react. The whispers intensified, filling my mind, pushing out everything else. The song, the voices, the presence, they were all merging, blending into something far worse than I could have imagined. I couldn't tell where the music ended and the whispers began. It was all the same now, a single, suffocating entity that had taken control of me. Her hand was almost upon me now. I could feel it hovering just inches from my skin, the coldness radiating from it like ice. The whispers in my head became more frantic, desperate, as if they were urging me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. Then, as her hand reached out to touch me, everything stopped. The music stopped. The whispers stopped. The figures in the room froze in place. The air was still. The silence was deafening. I stood there, trembling, my body shaking with fear and confusion. The coldness still clung to me, but the pressure had lifted, leaving me feeling hollow, like I was no longer part of the world I had once known. I tried to take a breath, but it felt like my lungs were filled with water, struggling to pull in air. And then, before I could react, the room around me began to fade, the edges of my vision blurring, like the world was slipping away. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up, hoping that everything would return to normal. But when I opened them again, I was no longer in the apartment. I was back in my own, but the song was still playing. The air was heavy with the same oppressive melody, and the whispers had returned, echoing in the back of my mind. The figures from the apartment, those hollow-eyed, silent watchers, were still with me, lingering just beyond the edges of my sight. I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape, and the song would never stop. The walls of my apartment were closing in again. The once familiar space now felt foreign, suffocating. The music, the song that had once been distant and strange, was now all I could hear, all I could feel. It surrounded me like a living thing, a constant presence that consumed my every thought. I tried to move, tried to step away from the source of the sound, but no matter where I went, it followed me. The melody, the whispers, everything about it was pulling me deeper into its grasp. I had no control over my own actions anymore. The figures from the apartment, they were here. I could feel them standing just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, their hollow eyes watching me. I could sense them, their presence pressing down on me, their gaze heavy on my shoulders, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the music, as if the very air had become a part of it. It was as though I was in a world where only the song existed, and everything else, my fears, my thoughts, my very sense of self, was being erased, replaced by the haunting melody that refused to stop. I collapsed to my knees, my hands clutching my ears, desperate to block it out, but it was inside me now, deep in my mind, impossible to escape. The whispers, the voices, they were speaking again, louder this time, filling every corner of my mind. Their words were distorted, tangled in the music, but I could feel their urgency, their desperation. They were calling me, begging me to understand. I couldn't hear the words, not fully, but I could sense their meaning. The song, it wasn't just a melody. It was a curse. A trap. The figures I had seen in the apartment, those hollow-eyed beings, they were once like me, caught in the same fate, driven by the same song that now controlled me. I looked around, my vision blurring as the room twisted, shifted, like the world itself was warping under the weight of the music. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me, their shapes becoming more distinct, more solid. The figures, they were getting closer. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, the chill seeping into my bones. Their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were burning into me, demanding that I listen. The song played louder, the notes sharpening, becoming more urgent. The whispers grew frantic, blending with the music until they were one. I stood up, shaking, unable to breathe, unable to think. My feet moved on their own, taking me toward the door, toward the hallway. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if it even mattered. I just needed to get away, needed to escape the pressure, the coldness, the music. But as I reached for the door, I saw it. The woman with the hollow eyes was standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. Her face was pale, her hair dark, and her eyes, those eyes, were empty, staring right through me. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The music, it was her voice. The whispers, it was her song. I tried to push past her, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The music was inside me now, a part of me, a force that I couldn't escape. The figures in the shadows closed in, their eyes locked on mine, their presence growing stronger. And then I heard it, the final note of the song. It was sharp, piercing, like a knife through the air, and in that moment, everything changed. The room, the world, collapsed. The walls, the shadows, the figures, they all vanished in an instant, leaving me alone in the silence. The music stopped. The whispers stopped. The figures, their hollow eyes, their cold, unblinking gaze, they were gone. I stood in the empty apartment, the air still and quiet, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was deafening, almost as painful as the song had been. I was alone, but I wasn't free. The melody still echoed in my mind, the whispers still clinging to the edges of my thoughts. They wouldn't let go. They wouldn't stop. I had been marked. The song, the curse, it wasn't over. It was inside me, and it would never leave. I could hear it now, in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. The figures, the woman, the music, they were still with me, always. And they would never let me go. The room felt like a tomb. Silent. Still. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, as though I had been holding it for hours. The melody, that relentless, haunting tune, lingered in my mind, just beneath the surface, like a forgotten memory refusing to fade. I stumbled away from the door, my hands trembling. Every step felt wrong. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, as if the very foundation of the apartment was shifting. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now, thicker, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I wanted to leave. I needed to escape. But no matter how much I tried, the exit, the world outside, felt like it was slipping farther and farther away. The walls around me seemed to grow taller, closing in. The whispers, faint at first, were now growing louder again, like distant voices calling to me from the dark. "Go," they whispered. "Stay." The conflicting words mixed with the melody, and I found myself frozen, unable to move, paralyzed by the pull of the music. The figures, those hollow-eyed beings, were there again, standing in the dark, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open as though they were about to speak, but no words came. The song played on, drawing me deeper, pulling me into its grip. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but the images were still there, burned into my mind. The woman's face, the dark figures, the music, everything was blurred together, a chaotic mess of sounds and images that I couldn't escape. Then, I heard something that cut through the noise. A sound so sharp, so sudden, it made my heart stop. The piano. It was playing again, but this time it wasn't from the apartment. It wasn't from anywhere at all. It was inside me. The music, distorted, twisted, wrong, was now part of my very being. I could feel it in my bones, coursing through my veins. It was like the very rhythm of my heart had become this song, and I was powerless to stop it. The whispers were now screams, the song a constant force I couldn't ignore, couldn't break free from. I collapsed to the ground, clutching my head, the sound echoing in my mind. The darkness around me swirled and danced, taking shape, forming into the figures once more. They moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The woman with the hollow eyes was the last to approach. She was different now. Her face was twisted in a grotesque grin, her body shifting unnaturally, as though she was both here and not here, a shadow of something real. She reached out to me, her fingers cold as ice. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice no longer human, but a distorted echo of the song. "You never will." I tried to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped. Trapped in the melody, trapped in the darkness. I could feel the weight of their presence, the coldness of their touch. They were closing in on me, pulling me into their world, a world where the song never stopped, where the whispers never ceased. I tried to stand, tried to break free, but the song, so beautiful, so terrible, had consumed me. I was part of it now, part of the nightmare. The music, the whispers, the figures, they were all I would ever know. And as the last note of the song played, I realized the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. The song was eternal, and so was the darkness. Have you ever driven through the night when the road seems endless and the only company is the quiet hum of your engine? The sort of journey where your mind begins to wander, where you start to lose track of time and space, and the world outside feels like it's slipping away from you? I was on one such drive when it happened. I had been driving for hours, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness, the road ahead barely visible. The usual sense of solitude that comes with long drives at night didn't feel quite so comforting this time. There was an unease creeping up on me, a tension I couldn't shake off. Maybe it was the fog, which had slowly begun to roll in, dense and cold, almost like a wall around me. I'd been heading through a stretch of countryside for a while when I saw it, the bridge. It wasn't a grand bridge by any means. In fact, it looked almost old-fashioned, something out of forgotten time, its arches barely visible through the growing fog. But it was there, and I had no choice but to cross it to continue on my route. The road had narrowed, and the bridge seemed to be the only way forward. As I approached, the air grew heavier, the fog thicker, and my headlights did little to pierce through the dense white. I could barely make out the edges of the road, the guardrails blending into the mist, almost invisible. A strange stillness had settled around me. There were no sounds, no distant animals, no rustling trees, just an overwhelming quiet that made my skin crawl. I crossed the first few feet of the bridge and immediately felt something wasn't right. The fog seemed to swallow up the road behind me, making it impossible to see where I had come from. I slowed down, trying to remain calm. But as I reached the middle of the bridge, the engine sputtered. The car jolted, the lights flickered, and the engine suddenly went silent. I pressed down on the accelerator, but nothing happened. I tried turning the ignition again, but the car refused to start. I was stuck in the middle of the bridge, surrounded by nothing but a dense, suffocating fog. Panic slowly began to creep in. I sat there for a moment, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. The quiet around me was almost unbearable, and the feeling of isolation settled like a weight on my chest. The road had been empty for miles, no other cars, no signs of life. I was alone. Or, at least, I thought I was. Then I heard it. A whisper. So faint at first, I wasn't sure if it was real. A soft sound, like the rustling of fabric or the shuffling of feet. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the fog, somewhere out of sight, too far for me to make out any details. But it was there. The whisper grew louder, a low murmur that seemed to surround me, as if the very fog itself was alive. I leaned forward, trying to peer into the thick mist, but there was nothing. Just the endless white, swallowing up the world around me. The car felt like a tiny island in the middle of an ocean of fog, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. And then I saw them. Shadows. Figures emerging from the mist, moving slowly, silently. At first, I thought they were just shapes created by the fog, but as they drew closer, I could see them more clearly. They were human figures, their outlines blurred, their movements unnaturally slow, as though they were walking through water. I couldn't make out their faces. They were too far away, and the fog distorted everything, but something about them was wrong. They didn't seem real. They felt like ghosts. Their bodies shifted in and out of the mist, and each time they moved, they got closer. My heart raced as I fumbled with the car's door handle, but the door wouldn't open. The figures continued to approach, growing more distinct, their silhouettes becoming clearer, their shapes more defined. I could hear their footsteps now, slow and deliberate, each one echoing in the silence. I needed to get out. But I was trapped. The fog seemed to thicken even more, wrapping around the car, making it impossible to see beyond the few feet of space in front of me. The figures, those shadows, were almost upon me now. I could hear them whispering, their voices low and unintelligible, as if they were speaking directly into my mind. And then the car's lights went out completely. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the whispers grew louder. The shadows moved even closer, and I could feel the coldness of their presence pressing against me, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the fear, real, tangible fear, gripped me. I didn't know what these figures were, or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The darkness was absolute, and the silence was deafening. It felt as though the world had disappeared, leaving only the fog, the shadows, and me. I could hear my heartbeat, a loud and frantic rhythm in the silence, but I couldn't hear the figures anymore. It was as if they had stopped moving, no footsteps, no whispering. just the dense fog pressing in on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think clearly. The cold air inside the car was stifling, and the windows were fogged up from my breath, making it harder to see anything. My hands trembled as they clutched the steering wheel, my breath shallow and quick. Then I heard it again, a soft sound, just at the edge of my hearing, like a low murmur. At first, I thought it was in my head, but it wasn't. It was real. And it was coming closer. The figures were still out there, moving in the fog. I couldn't see them, but I felt their presence. I felt them getting closer, like they were right outside the car, pressing against the windows, staring in. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, the chill cutting through me like a knife. I could see my breath now, swirling in the air, even though I hadn't touched the controls. The shadows outside shifted. They weren't just moving anymore. They were circling. Slowly. Methodically. Like predators toying with their prey. I slammed my hand against the door again, desperate to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was nothing, just the fog and the shadows closing in. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure appeared, not from the fog, but from the bridge itself. It was as if the mist parted to reveal it. It stood just beyond the car's headlights, tall and unnaturally still. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its outline indistinct. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze. Cold. Unblinking. Like it was staring directly into my soul. A low, guttural sound escaped from the figure. Not a word. Not a scream. Just a sound, like an animal's growl, deep and menacing. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something. But my body refused to move. It was as if I was paralyzed, held in place by some unseen force. The figure took a step forward, then another, and the fog seemed to part around it, as though it was commanding the mist itself to retreat. I blinked, and the figure was closer. Much closer. My heart pounded in my chest. The shadow reached for the car door, its hand impossibly long, its fingers stretching as though they were made of the very mist that surrounded us. The door handle clicked as the figure twisted its hand, trying to open it. I gasped and yanked the door in the opposite direction, trying to break free from its grip, but the door wouldn't move. It was stuck, held in place by something far stronger than the lock. The figure's fingers touched the window, and I could see them through the foggy glass, long, pale, and ghostly. The sound of them scraping against the glass echoed through my skull like nails on a chalkboard. The growl became louder, more distinct. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I didn't care what was out there, I just couldn't stay in the car any longer. In a panic, I unbuckled my seatbelt and scrambled to push open the door. It finally gave, creaking open just enough for me to slip out. But as soon as I stepped out onto the bridge, the cold air hit me like a wave. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, like the fog itself was alive, breathing down on me. I didn't know what I was running from or where I was running to. My mind was racing, every step felt heavier, but I couldn't stop. The fog seemed to close in around me again, even thicker than before. And then I heard it, the softest, faintest sound, like a faint melody, carried through the mist. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. The last remnants of the terror I was feeling. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't my imagination. It was real. A song. A haunting melody, soft and eerie, like an old lullaby, drifting through the fog. The melody seemed to call to me, pulling me toward it. It was strange, familiar, yet foreign. Something about it felt like it had always been there, waiting for me. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself walking toward the sound, following the music despite every warning in my head. With each step, the music grew louder, clearer. But so did the shadows. The figures in the fog. I could feel them around me now, moving, watching. I tried to fight it. I wanted to scream, to run, but the melody was drawing me like a moth to a flame. I stopped walking, suddenly realizing what was happening. The bridge. The fog. The figures. The music. They weren't just waiting for me. They were guiding me. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a normal bridge. This wasn't a normal fog. This wasn't even a normal place. It was a trap. A place where time and reality bent, and I had stepped into it without even knowing. And the worst part? The music wasn't just drawing me in. It was taking my will, my very mind, piece by piece, until I wasn't even sure I'd be able to leave. But maybe I never was meant to. I stood there, my legs stiff and trembling, as the fog closed in around me. The song, no, it wasn't just a song. It was something more. It was a pull, a force, something ancient that had been waiting for me. The figures in the fog hadn't moved, not yet, but I could feel their presence more keenly now, like shadows pressing against my skin. The music was louder now, clear as a bell, but each note sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't calming, it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like a lullaby that lured you to sleep, but never woke you again. I turned around, hoping to see the car, my escape route, but the bridge behind me was lost in the thick mist, the headlights barely visible through the fog. I had no choice now but to move forward. The figures that had been circling me earlier were now just shapes, dark and indistinct. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. They weren't human, nothing about them felt human. Yet, they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to continue walking. Each step felt harder than the last, the fog pulling at my legs like I was walking through quicksand. I couldn't stop moving toward the sound. I had no control over it anymore. The music seemed to drown out everything else. The shadows pressed closer, their outlines more defined now, their features becoming clearer with each passing second. And then I saw it. The source of the music. It was a figure, standing alone in the center of the bridge, its back to me. It wasn't like the others. This one was different. It didn't belong in the fog. The shape was tall and twisted, cloaked in the same shadowy mist, but there was something about it that felt human, almost. I took a hesitant step forward. The figure didn't move. Its presence was suffocating, pulling me in, and for a moment, I was unsure whether I was walking toward it or if it was pulling me toward it. And then the figure turned. Its face, if you could even call it that, was completely devoid of any recognizable features. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface, like a blank canvas. And as it turned to face me, I felt my body freeze in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It raised one long, impossibly thin arm toward me, and the music began to swell. The melody became a song, a deep, mournful lullaby that made the air around me thick and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 years of sorrow. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart pounding louder with every note. And then I heard its voice. It wasn't a voice at all, not in the traditional sense. It was more of a thought, a whisper, inside my head, something that wasn't really said out loud, but felt deep in my core. "You're here now." I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its energy almost suffocating. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, caught in a web of its power. "You shouldn't have come." I tried to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't leave my mouth. The air grew thicker, pressing in on me. The fog seemed to grow denser with every passing second, its tendrils curling around my legs, wrapping around my throat. It wasn't just a fog. It was the song, the melody, and whatever that figure was. It was feeding on my fear. "There's no way out." The words echoed in my mind, and suddenly, I understood. The bridge wasn't a bridge. It wasn't a way to cross. It was a trap, an eternal prison. Anyone who stepped onto it was bound to it forever, caught in the fog, forever searching for an escape that would never come. I had been brought here for a reason. The figure, the song, it had been waiting for me. And now that I was here, there was no leaving. Not physically. Not mentally. And in that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't just trapped on the bridge. I was becoming part of it. The shadows around me began to shift, their forms solidifying into humanoid shapes, their faces twisted in silent agony. They moved toward me, slowly, relentlessly, their hands reaching out. And with every step they took, the fog grew thicker. The music swirled, filling my head, drowning out everything else. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could hear was the song, getting louder, until it was all I could hear. Until it was all I was. The figure stepped closer, its long, pale hand reaching out to touch my forehead. And I felt something, an icy cold, but also a deep, aching warmth, like the embrace of something long forgotten. Something that had been waiting for me. Waiting for all of us. "You're mine now." And then the world went dark. I woke to silence. Not the kind of quiet you'd expect after a long night or in the midst of a peaceful moment. No, this silence was hollow. It rang in my ears like a vacuum, pressing against my skull, suffocating me with its emptiness. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I was no longer on the bridge. The fog was gone, yet the feeling of being trapped lingered like a thick fog in my mind. I stood, unsteady at first, my limbs numb and heavy. My hands were shaking as I tried to wipe the sweat off my face. The last thing I remembered, the music, the figure, the whispering words, was so vivid that it almost felt like I was still there. Still trapped. But I wasn't. Or at least, I thought I wasn't. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. It was an unfamiliar place, dark, like the dead of night. A small room, with walls that seemed to close in on me, suffocating me in their isolation. The air was cold, damp, like the chill you'd find in a forgotten basement or a tomb. I took a step forward, and that's when I noticed something strange. There was a soft sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was the same song, the same haunting melody I had heard before, only now it was distant. Faint. I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. The melody, it couldn't be. I had left the bridge, hadn't I? I had escaped, had I? The music swirled around me, wrapping me in its invisible tendrils. It wasn't coming from the walls, not from any speakers or instruments. It was in my head, in the very air I breathed, filling my thoughts until I couldn't think of anything else. Until I couldn't do anything else. The figure, the one with the smooth face, flashed before my eyes. Its presence loomed over me like a shadow, whispering to me again, its words ringing inside my skull as if it was still here, in the room with me. You thought you escaped, but you can never leave. Not now. I tried to move, to force myself to turn away from the sound, from the pull that was taking hold of me again, but my body wouldn't respond. I was caught. In a place I didn't know. In a trap I couldn't see. The music grew louder. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. The darkness around me deepened, as though the very air was thickening, becoming suffocating. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, no, it wasn't just a corner. It was the edge of a door that wasn't there before. A door that seemed to form from the shadows themselves, just as the figure had. I tried to move toward it, but I was too slow. I felt the pull on my mind before I even realized what was happening. The door was more than a door, it was another part of the trap. Another place that would never let me go. The song continued to play, louder now, until it was all I could hear. And the figures, those shadows, they were here, in the room with me. I could see them now, flickering in and out of existence, their forms distorted, twisted by the fog that had once surrounded them. They reached out with their long, skeletal hands, their faces obscured, their features a blur. They weren't just moving toward me, they were moving through me, their presence an overwhelming weight that pressed against every inch of my body. One of them stepped forward, its hand cold and ethereal, as it reached for my face. No escape. It whispered, its voice deep and guttural, vibrating through the very air. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the room shrinking around me. The fog, the music, everything was closing in again. I had been tricked. The bridge hadn't been the trap. The fog wasn't the prison. The song was. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was drowning in the sound, in the pull of the music that never stopped, that never would. The figures closed in on me, their eyes, if they had them, locked onto mine, drawing me in. They had been waiting, watching, just as the figure on the bridge had. And then I understood. I wasn't meant to escape. No one ever was. The song had taken me, it had taken me long ago, and now it was too late. The figures, the fog, the haunting melody, it wasn't just something that trapped you. It became you. In that moment, I realized what had happened to everyone who had crossed that bridge before me. I wasn't alive anymore. I was just another part of the song. The room faded into darkness. The figures that had once been shadows surrounded me. Their presence, no longer frightening, became a part of me. I could feel them in my veins, in my thoughts. And the song played on. Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt like something wasn't quite right? You could swear your reflection didn't match your own movement, or that it lingered a little longer than it should have. Or worse, that something, or someone, was watching you from inside the glass? What if the people you see in the mirror aren't just reflections, but something more? Something alive? I first noticed it one late evening after I had just finished dinner. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic filtering through the window. I was alone, just like usual, but the house felt strange, as if something had shifted. I'd been living in this small one-bedroom for a few months now. It was nothing special, just a place to sleep and eat. Yet tonight, it felt different. I walked past the bathroom mirror and, as usual, glanced at my reflection. but something made me stop. I had seen that exact reflection 1,000 times before. I had walked past that mirror at least a dozen times this evening alone. But now, something felt off. My reflection, for a brief moment, seemed to hesitate just a second longer than my own movements. I thought it was nothing, just tired eyes playing tricks. But then, I noticed something else. My reflection was smiling. I was certain I hadn't smiled. I took a step back, staring at the mirror. The smile in the reflection slowly turned into something more sinister, a grin, wide and stretched, but completely unnatural. It wasn't me. I couldn't look away. It was as if my reflection was mocking me, moving without my control, as though it was alive, independent. My heart began to race. I turned my head to look at the rest of the apartment, checking the doors and windows. But nothing. I was alone. I stepped closer to the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The reflection didn't follow my movements exactly. It was off. Slightly delayed. My hands reached for the edge of the sink, and the reflection's hands reached a moment too late. But the worst part was the eyes. They were no longer looking back at me. They were looking past me. I could almost feel the presence of something behind me. I spun around quickly, heart thundering in my chest. The room was empty. The bathroom door had been shut when I walked in, and there was no one in the hallway outside. But when I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was no longer just mimicking my actions. It was moving on its own. The grin on my reflection stretched further, and I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. I backed away, but the reflection didn't stop. It began to wave, not in the casual way I had, but with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if it was trying to catch my attention. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the edge of the bathtub. And then, for the first time since I had moved in, I felt something I had never experienced before. It was a pressure, a weight on my chest, as though the room had become tighter, smaller. The lights flickered above me, and I could hear the low hum of the bathroom fan, which now sounded distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere deeper, further away. I looked back at the mirror and saw something more. The reflection of my face had changed. My features were the same, but my eyes were hollow, black, empty. The smile had turned into something grotesque. It was no longer my face, but someone else's, a face I didn't recognize, with a stare that seemed to pierce through me. And then, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, the reflection lifted its hand and reached out. I froze, heart hammering, unable to move. The hand on the other side of the glass pressed against the mirror, just inches from my own. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, unable to make a sound. I stepped backward, stumbling over the bathtub, and before I could react, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could feel something shift in the air, the sense of being watched. I heard the soft sound of breathing, but it didn't come from me. It came from the mirror. In the dark, I could still feel its presence. Something in the glass was moving, watching, waiting. I had to get away. But when I tried to step toward the door, my legs felt heavy. My feet wouldn't move. The reflection had stopped smiling. It was coming closer. I couldn't breathe. The weight on my chest was unbearable, as if the very air had thickened around me, pressing against my lungs, squeezing the life out of me. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. But there was none. Nothing made sense. The mirror, my reflection, was no longer just a passive image. It was something else entirely. something that wanted me. I stumbled away from the bathroom, hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the lights flickered again, and for a brief second, I saw them. They weren't just reflections anymore. There were people standing in the mirror now, faces, twisted and grotesque, staring at me with hollow eyes. Their mouths were open, but no sound came out. It was as if they were trying to scream, but the glass had stolen their voices. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that mirror as possible, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed. "Get out," I whispered to myself, forcing my legs to move, dragging myself toward the door. But when I looked back at the mirror, I saw that the reflection wasn't still anymore. The people in the glass were moving. They were no longer standing in place, frozen. They were reaching out, their hands pressed against the mirror, their fingers stretching, curling, as if they were trying to break through. I froze again. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. The faces, distorted and warped, some smiling, some crying, others blank with despair, seemed to change with each blink. It was as if the mirror wasn't reflecting me at all anymore. Instead, it was showing something else. Something that didn't belong here. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A soft thud, almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. My pulse shot up. I turned around. The apartment was still dark, but the low hum of the refrigerator was louder now, filling the silence. My hands trembled as I grabbed the door handle again, forcing myself to step into the hallway. The mirror's image was still imprinted in my mind, the faces, the reaching hands, and the lingering sense of something wrong. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But as I walked down the narrow hallway, I noticed something I hadn't before. The walls. The way they seemed to warp ever so slightly, as though they were closing in on me. The corners of the apartment, once familiar and comforting, now looked darker, more oppressive. The air felt heavier with each step. I could feel the eyes of the reflection still on me, even though I was far from the bathroom. It was as though the glass had followed me, its cold gaze never leaving my back. When I reached the living room, I stopped. The apartment was eerily silent. Too silent. There was no sound of traffic outside, no sounds of movement from other apartments. Just stillness. And then I heard it. A faint scratching. It came from the direction of the bathroom. Soft at first, like something brushing against the wall. Then, louder. More distinct. The sound of nails, sharp, frantic, desperate, scraping against the glass. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to acknowledge that whatever was happening wasn't just in my mind. But I couldn't help it. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me back toward the bathroom, toward that cursed mirror. As I approached the door, the scratching grew louder. It was no longer just nails, it was something else. Something that had grown in intensity, as if the thing inside the glass was fighting to escape. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open. The mirror was now completely different. It wasn't reflecting the bathroom at all. Instead, it showed a dark, foggy landscape. A place I didn't recognize. There were no people in the mirror anymore, no faces, no hands. Just darkness. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and something in the reflection moved. I jerked back, but the mirror followed me. It wasn't just an image anymore. It was as if it had become a doorway, something alive, pulling me in. And then, I heard the voice. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't the voice of anyone I knew. It was a whisper, soft and cold, echoing from the depths of the glass. "Come closer," it said. "We're waiting." The breath caught in my throat. My body was frozen in place. The voice was familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was the voice of someone who knew everything about me, someone who wanted something from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The reflection in the mirror began to shift again. This time, it wasn't just faces, hands, or shapes. It was something worse. A figure started to emerge from the fog. Tall, dark, and blurry at first, but slowly becoming clearer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure was dressed in black, but its face was like nothing I had ever seen. It was an empty, gaping void with no features, no eyes, no mouth, just an endless, dark abyss. The figure raised its hand toward me, and as it did, I felt the room grow even colder. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears, as though the figure was inside me, pulling me closer, drawing me toward it. I took a step backward, but the figure stepped forward at the same time. It was moving through the glass. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away, to escape. But the sound of the whispering voice and the scratching nails followed me, echoing in my ears. "Come closer." I couldn't escape. My pulse was racing, my legs trembling as I bolted down the hallway. The apartment seemed to stretch, its walls closing in around me, suffocating, as if the very air was thickening with each frantic step. The sounds from behind me, scratching, whispering, clung to my ears, haunting me, pulling at my sanity. I had to get out. I had to escape before it reached me. The front door was just ahead. I could see it now, standing like a distant promise of safety. But even as I reached for the door handle, I felt a coldness seeping through the walls, creeping into my skin. The chill wasn't just from the air anymore, it was something else. Something wrong. I paused. The door, no, everything seemed different now. The light outside had dimmed, the night growing darker than before. And then, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. There was a figure standing by the door. A shadow, just barely visible in the corner of my eye, standing perfectly still, like it had been there for ages, waiting. I blinked, but when I looked back, it was gone. The whispering voice was louder now, echoing through the apartment, like 1,000 voices rising in unison. "Come closer." I reached for the door again, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I turned the handle. The cold metal burned my skin, and I yanked the door open with everything I had. But there was nothing. No street. No world outside. Just more fog. Thick, choking fog, rolling in from the darkness, as if the night itself had crept inside. The streets were gone. The lights, the cars, the sounds of the city, they were all swallowed up by the mist. And standing in the center of it, bathed in an unnatural glow, was the mirror. It was impossible. The mirror shouldn't have been there. I had just left it. I'd run away from it. But now, it was standing before me, its surface rippling like water, reflecting nothing but the endless, gray fog. I stumbled back, my breath quickening, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to leave, but my feet were frozen to the floor. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come closer, you can't run from us." I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, behind me. But the apartment was still empty. No shadows. No figures. No movement. Just the silence, oppressive and heavy, settling around me. It's not real, I thought, shaking my head. None of this is real. But as I turned back to the mirror, I saw something, no, someone moving within it. A figure stepped into view. Tall, looming, its face a black void, an endless abyss. It reached toward me, its hand stretched out through the glass, its fingers curling in invitation. Don't move, my mind screamed, but my body betrayed me. I took a step forward, my feet dragging me closer, helpless against the force pulling me toward the mirror. Come closer, we've been waiting. The voice was louder now, so close that it felt like it was in my very head, in my blood. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. It was as if the mirror had become a part of me, the reflection and the reality merging, twisting together in a dance that I had no control over. I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed against the cool glass, everything stopped. The fog around me thickened, pressing against me, suffocating me. The air turned to ice, and I could feel the chill deep in my bones. The reflection in the mirror, the reflection that wasn't mine anymore, smiled. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of hunger, of something dark and ancient. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The figure in the mirror pulled its hand through the surface, and then, just like that, the glass shattered. The sharp sound of cracking glass echoed through the apartment, and before I could react, the figure lunged at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My breath caught in my throat, my heart thundering in my chest. The darkness from the mirror poured out, wrapping around me like a vice, suffocating me with its cold, twisted tendrils. This is it. The thought crossed my mind, clear as day. I'm trapped. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, the darkness receded. The figure was gone. The mirror was back to its usual, harmless self, reflecting the empty, fog-filled apartment. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling with shock. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Had it all been a hallucination? But then I noticed something. A small detail. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine anymore. It was different. My face, my eyes, were gone. In their place was the same dark, empty void I had seen in the mirror's reflection, staring back at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the realization hit me. I had already stepped through. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection wasn't just a twisted version of myself, it was me, but not. It was as if the reflection was trying to replace me, to drag me into a world that I didn't belong to. I took a step back, my body shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But as I moved, the reflection followed. It was like watching a shadow mimic my every move, only it was growing more and more disjointed. The edges of the reflection warped, the lines of my face blurring and stretching, as if something was reaching through, pulling at my very soul. This isn't happening, I thought desperately. This can't be happening. But the mirror told a different story. The reflection wasn't just standing still anymore. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, its hands reaching out, fingers splayed, as if trying to grasp me, pull me in. I could hear its breathing, low and ragged, matching mine. And yet, it wasn't my breath. It was something else, something darker. My pulse quickened as I realized the reflection wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was alive. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "Stay away from me." But the figure in the mirror didn't listen. It stepped forward, its shadow stretching further across the room until it was no longer confined to the glass. I stumbled backward, my body slamming into the cold wall behind me. But there was no escape. The figure was right there, standing in the middle of the room, watching me with eyes that were nothing but black voids, empty and endless. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection raised its hand toward me, and before I could react, I felt a cold, unseen force wrap around my wrist, pulling me toward the mirror. I fought, my heart racing, my muscles straining, but it was no use. The pull was too strong. It was as if the mirror was no longer just a surface, it was a doorway, a portal that wanted to consume me, to drag me into whatever nightmare lay on the other side. I reached for the door, my fingers brushing against the handle, but the reflection reached out faster, its grip tightening around my arm. It was too late. The mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 shards, each piece reflecting a different version of me. I saw myself from every angle, every perspective, and yet none of them felt right. Each reflection was twisted, contorted, as if I was being pulled in every direction at once. I felt my body being yanked toward the broken glass, but I fought back with everything I had. My fingers dug into the wall behind me, the rough surface scraping my skin, but the pull of the mirror was too powerful. The force of it surged through me, dragging me closer, until I was forced to take one final step into the shards of glass. And then, nothing. For a moment, there was only darkness, cold and suffocating, the kind that wrapped around you like a wet cloth, drowning every sense. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. I was weightless, lost in the void. But then, I felt something. A touch. Soft, cool fingers brushing against my skin. And then, another. I gasped, the sensation grounding me, pulling me out of the emptiness. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dim light, and found myself standing in a place that wasn't my own. I was no longer in the apartment. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast, empty space, one that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick, humid, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost like sand, but the color was wrong, too gray, too lifeless. And standing before me, just beyond my reach, was the reflection. It was me, but not. It was the same figure I had seen in the mirror, only now, it wasn't confined to the glass. It was real. Alive. And it was smiling at me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. The figure stepped closer, its eyes gleaming with something dark, something that made my blood run cold. It raised a hand toward me, the same hand I had seen in the mirror, and as it touched my cheek, a sharp pain shot through me, as if my very soul was being torn apart. And then, the voice. "It's over now." The whisper filled my mind, soft and insistent, like a haunting lullaby. "You're ours now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But I was trapped. I had crossed over. The mirror had taken me. The reflection stepped forward, its cold, empty eyes fixed on mine, and in that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't just the mirror that had changed me. It was the world on the other side. And it was hungry. I had become part of it. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every breath felt like I was inhaling the very essence of death. I stood in the endless gray space, my body trembling, not from cold, but from the sheer terror that gripped my heart. The reflection, no, the creature, stared at me, its smile widening, its eyes hollow and unblinking. It wasn't just a twisted version of myself anymore. It had become something else, something far darker. Something hungry. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the very ground beneath me had a mind of its own, rooting me to the spot. The reflection, the thing that was once me, began to circle me, each step slow and deliberate, as though savoring my fear. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "You crossed over. There's no going back." The words sent a jolt of panic through my chest. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice stolen. Instead, I could only watch in horror as the reflection, no, the thing, continued to circle, its gaze never leaving mine. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but every time I shut them, the whispering grew louder, the pressure heavier. It was in my head now, filling every corner of my mind with images of darkness and torment. I was the reflection. I had become it, just as it had become me. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was as though something was digging into my heart, pulling at it from the inside. I gasped, my body convulsing, but no sound escaped. The pain intensified, and I could feel myself slipping away, my body growing weaker. "You belong here," the creature cooed, its voice wrapping around my mind like a noose. "This is where you were always meant to be." I wanted to scream again, to fight, but I could feel my strength fading. The world around me seemed to warp and distort, the grayness of the space closing in on me like a vice. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt it, something pulling me. It wasn't the reflection. It wasn't the thing that had replaced me. It was something else, something softer, gentler. A warm, familiar sensation, like the touch of a hand that I had longed for, but hadn't realized I missed. I opened my eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, someone standing in the shadows, watching me with eyes that weren't hollow, that weren't hungry. It was a human face, a real face, not like the creature that stood before me. With what little strength I had left, I forced myself to look toward the figure. And then, I understood. It wasn't just the reflection that had trapped me here. It was the mirror itself. This world, this place of grayness and pain, was its prison. A prison for those who crossed over, those who looked too deeply into the glass. I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by others who had crossed over before me. Their faces, twisted with fear, lined the edges of the gray space, their eyes pleading for release. They were trapped here, just like me, part of the reflection, part of the dark world behind the mirror. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the longer I stayed here, the more I would become one of them. The creature in front of me grinned wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It stepped forward, and I felt a coldness radiating from it, like an ice storm crashing into my very soul. I could feel myself slipping, my identity fading, as if it were trying to take me completely. But then, the figure in the distance moved. It took a step forward, and the grayness around me shifted. The whispers grew louder, the pressure greater, but the figure didn't stop. With each step, the figure came closer, and I could hear it calling to me, its voice soft, comforting. A promise. And for the first time since I had crossed over, I felt a flicker of hope. I didn't know if I could escape, if there was even a way out. But I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't try, if I stayed here in this place of endless reflection, I would become just another shadow in the mirror, lost forever. I took a deep breath, gathering what little courage I had left. I focused on the figure, the one who seemed real, who seemed to care. And then, with all the strength I could muster, I turned and ran. The world around me shifted. The whispers screamed in my ears, clawing at my mind, but I kept my eyes on the figure, my only hope, as I ran toward the edge of the gray space. The creature behind me howled, its voice now a furious roar, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, in an instant, the space around me shattered. The grayness broke apart, and I was falling through the cracks of the mirror. I closed my eyes, my heart racing, unsure if I would ever wake up again. When I opened them, I was back in my apartment, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. The room was silent, still. The mirror, my mirror, was intact, unbroken. I looked around, half expecting to see the reflection staring back at me, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the room. But I knew deep down that I hadn't escaped. The mirror hadn't released me. It was still waiting, watching. And I couldn't help but wonder how long I had before it would call me back, before the reflection would come for me again. Have you ever looked at something and immediately felt that something wasn't quite right? That feeling when your eyes tell you one thing, but your mind refuses to accept it? I first noticed the footprints on the ceiling 2 nights ago. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just the shadows playing with my tired eyes. The apartment is old, and the cracks in the ceiling sometimes make strange patterns, especially at night when the lamp flickers. But the next morning, they were still there. Faint, but undeniably clear, bare, with footprints stretching across the living room ceiling. I know what you're thinking. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe you were just too tired, and your mind played tricks. But I wasn't asleep. I had been reading a book, lying on the couch, when I first saw them. The footprints were small, the kind that belonged to someone barefoot, and they moved in a straight line across the ceiling. I told myself I must have missed them earlier. After all, the apartment is in disarray, boxes scattered everywhere, things piled up. Still, something gnawed at me. The air in the room had changed. It felt colder somehow. The chill wasn't from the weather, it was more like the atmosphere itself had thickened. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the old building playing tricks. Maybe my mind was just imagining things. But then, in the dead of night, I heard it. A soft sound, like something brushing against the ceiling, faint but unmistakable. I lay still, trying to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling. But then there it was again, scrape, scrape, as if something was moving up there, just above me. I couldn't help it. I had to look. I got out of bed slowly, as quietly as I could, trying not to wake up the stillness of the room. The air was thicker now, almost suffocating, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch longer. I stared up at the ceiling, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when I saw it again, the footprints. They were closer now. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't look away. The prints, still faint but undeniable, were now a few feet from where I slept. I felt a cold wave of unease wash over me. Something was moving closer. But how? No one could have entered my apartment. I hadn't heard a thing. I backed away from the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I needed to check the locks, the windows, anything that could explain this. But as I walked towards the door, a noise stopped me, a sharp thud above me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something shifting. I froze. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The idea that something, or someone, might be above me, walking across the ceiling, filled me with dread. The thought of it made my stomach twist. My head was racing. Was I going mad? Was this some sort of prank? But the air in the room was still thick, and every corner seemed to grow darker. I turned on the light, hoping the brightness would shoo away whatever was lurking in the shadows, but as soon as the light flickered on, I saw them, closer now. The footprints weren't just random marks anymore. They had form. They were becoming clearer, more pronounced with each passing second. They weren't just moving across the ceiling anymore, they were coming down. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel it, something was watching me. Something unseen. My pulse raced as the sound of slow, deliberate steps echoed in my mind, though no physical steps were made. Yet, every time I looked at the ceiling, those prints drew closer to me. I backed away from the room, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The prints weren't just on the ceiling anymore. They were on the walls, on the door, on the floor. Everywhere I looked, I saw them, bare feet, moving in my direction. As the night wore on, the pressure in the air grew heavier, suffocating. The sound of movement above me never stopped. And then, just before dawn, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was there, like a whisper brushing my ear. "You're next." That was the moment I knew, whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real. And it was coming for me. The whisper echoed in my ears, louder than my own heartbeat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, as if the fear had wrapped itself around me, tightening its grip with every passing second. I dared not move, afraid that even the smallest motion would attract whatever was creeping in the shadows above me. The room felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The air was thick with something unspoken, something ancient. The prints, which had once seemed harmless, now felt like a premonition. A warning. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, I told myself it was just my imagination. That it had to be. I had been under a lot of stress lately. The move to this apartment hadn't been easy, and I hadn't been sleeping well. But even as I tried to convince myself, the prints on the ceiling were undeniable. They weren't just there, they were closer, clearer than before. The soles of the feet were darker now, more defined, as if they had been left there purposefully, and the air around them felt wrong. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I spent the whole day pacing the apartment, too scared to sleep, too scared to leave. The thought of going outside, where I might be alone with my own thoughts, terrified me. My phone was useless. No one would believe me, would they? I couldn't even bring myself to call for help. Who would I call? What would I say? Hey, there are footprints on my ceiling, and they're getting closer every night. No one would understand. As nightfall approached, the house seemed to change. The walls were breathing, the lights flickered more frequently, and the temperature dropped. I sat up in the living room, the couch feeling like my only safe haven. I moved my pillow and blanket onto the floor, hoping the act of creating a barrier between me and the ceiling would bring some kind of comfort. But then, just as darkness began to blanket the room, I heard it again. The sound. Soft, rhythmic, and unmistakable. It was a gentle scraping at first, like someone running their nails across the surface above me. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. A slow, measured movement, as if something was pacing, getting closer with each step. I dared to glance up at the ceiling, and then I saw it. There, just above me, the prints had spread further. They had moved down the wall and now were on the edge of the ceiling, almost directly above my head. The pattern had changed. They weren't just random anymore. They were forming a shape, a trail leading somewhere, inching closer and closer to where I lay. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off of them. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It felt as though whatever had made those prints knew I was there, knew I was awake, and it was only a matter of time before it found me. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and the air felt thick with dread. And then, the sound stopped. I waited, my body tense, heart pounding in my chest. The silence was suffocating, almost as if the entire room was holding its breath. And then, I heard it. A soft shuffle, almost imperceptible, coming from just behind me. I turned around so quickly my neck creaked. But there was nothing. The room was still, too still. The darkness was thick, smothering everything in sight. But then, in the corner of the room, something moved. Just a shadow, barely a shape, but it was enough to send a cold rush of terror through me. I watched as the dark figure seemed to stretch, elongating into something more solid, more tangible. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped me. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. The figure was coming closer, its outline becoming clearer. It was tall, thin, and almost ghostly. Its arms reached out towards me, and I could feel the air shift with each movement it made. The prints on the ceiling, they were still there. And they were closer now. Much closer. I stood up, backing away from the figure, my eyes darting between it and the ceiling above me. Whatever it was real. It was not some figment of my imagination. It was here, and it was getting closer. With each step I took backward, the figure mirrored me. It moved without a sound, as if it had no weight, no form, yet it was there, solid, menacing. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I turned and ran to the door, but as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The door, it was locked. I had locked it earlier, hadn't I? I tugged on the knob desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was standing there now, its face, if you could call it that, barely visible. The faintest outline of a mouth stretched across its face, twisted in a grotesque grin. It was coming. I pulled harder on the door, but it was useless. My only escape was blocked by this thing. The prints on the ceiling were no longer above me. They were on the walls, closing in from all sides. I had no choice. The only way out was through. I gathered every ounce of strength I had, turned to face the creature, and screamed. The scream tore through my throat, raw and desperate, but it didn't seem to faze the figure. It just stood there, its face twisting into something darker, more horrifying. The room felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls pressing in, the air suffocating. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, and still, I couldn't make the door move. I had to get out. My mind was scrambling for any kind of solution, any way to escape, but there was nothing. The creature's hollow, unblinking eyes followed me with a terrible, knowing gaze. It wasn't even trying to move closer, it was simply waiting, as if savoring the fear it was eliciting. I backed away from the door, my feet stumbling over the floor until I was pressed up against the wall. The prints, those awful, unnatural prints, were on the walls now, all around me, creeping lower and lower. They had shifted in such a way that they now formed a pattern, almost like a web, threading its way toward me, trapping me in this corner. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the room again. It wasn't coming from the figure this time. No, this was something else. The noise came from above me, on the ceiling. And then, the unmistakable sensation of something shifting, moving. I looked up. The prints weren't just prints anymore. The feet had changed. They had lengthened, becoming more defined, as though they were no longer just an imprint, but something emerging, something alive. I could see the distinct shape of toes, each one moving slightly as if the invisible creature above me was walking on the ceiling, getting closer, inching forward with every moment. The feeling of being trapped was suffocating. The creature in the room with me was not moving, but it didn't need to. It was already controlling me. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me. But it wasn't just the creature that had me cornered. It was the ceiling, the prints, the way they were drawing closer with every passing second. I had to think. I had to do something. But what? Suddenly, an idea flashed through my mind, something so simple, yet so potentially dangerous. The window. Without thinking, I sprang to my feet and rushed to the window. My hands fumbled with the latch, my nerves making every movement feel like it was happening underwater. But it was stuck, locked tight. Panic surged through me again. Why was nothing working? The creature was still standing motionless, but I could feel it getting closer, its presence growing, wrapping itself around me like a vice. Then the ceiling shifted again. I heard a loud thud as something heavy landed with unnatural grace. And then the scraping began. Slow at first, but then more deliberate. The thing on the ceiling, whatever it was, had dropped down onto the walls, sliding down toward the floor as if it had no care for gravity at all. The prints followed it, the footfalls now moving across the room like a predator closing in on its prey. I spun around, my eyes wild, searching for an escape. My mind was racing. Do something. Think. The only thing left was the closet. I bolted for it, my legs trembling, but as I grabbed the handle, I froze. The figure had moved. It was no longer in the center of the room. It had crossed the floor in what seemed like an instant, and now it was standing in front of the closet, blocking the last possible way out. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to move. But I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to do anything as the figure loomed closer, its eyes boring into mine. The longer I stared, the more I felt myself slipping into its grasp. It wasn't just a figure, it was part of the apartment now, part of everything around me. It was the walls, the air, the light itself. It was everywhere. And then it smiled. A smile so wide, so unnatural, that I couldn't breathe. The smile stretched beyond what should have been possible, grotesque and stretched thin, like it was trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled back, my feet hitting the floor with an unsteady thud. The thing in front of me didn't move. It just waited. The silence was deafening. I could feel my sanity fraying at the edges. The prints, the creature, the suffocating air. Everything was closing in on me. But then something in my mind snapped into place, some desperate instinct for survival, for escape. Without thinking, I reached for the window again, this time using the edge of the nightstand as leverage. I pulled with all my might. The The latch gave way with a loud click, and the window creaked open. The cool air rushed in like a wave, filling my lungs with relief. But I didn't have time to feel it. The creature, it was already in motion. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to wonder what was happening. I jumped. The drop wasn't far, but I still felt the rush of panic as I hit the ground. I landed hard, pain shooting through my legs, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I stumbled up, my legs barely holding me, and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, out of its reach. And then I looked back. The apartment building was silent. Empty. No one would ever know what had happened to me. The thing in that apartment was still there, waiting for the next victim. But I had escaped. For now. I ran without looking back, the night air cold against my skin, cutting through the thin fabric of my clothes. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest aching with every step. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to be far from that apartment, from the thing that had almost claimed me. As I moved through the streets, my mind raced. Was it over? Had I truly escaped? The image of that grotesque smile, stretching impossibly wide, haunted me. It was burned into my mind, a reminder that whatever that thing was, it wasn't something I could escape so easily. It wasn't bound by the rules of reality. The streets were eerily quiet, the distant hum of the city a low, ominous backdrop. Not a single soul was around, and the streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long, jagged shadows. I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced over my shoulder, nothing. Just the empty road, stretching on forever. But something in the silence didn't sit right with me. It felt wrong, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached the park, and the familiar sight of the swing swaying slightly in the wind should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I stopped in front of them, my body shaking, my thoughts spiraling. It was then that I heard it, the faintest sound of something scraping, like nails on wood, from behind me. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I turned. The air felt colder now, the night pressing in on me. The sound came again, closer this time, more distinct, like something, or someone, was walking. My eyes darted around the park, trying to find the source of the noise. The playground was empty, the swing swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing. I was starting to lose it. I had to be. My mind was playing tricks on me. There was nothing there. I shook my head and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But then I saw it. At the far end of the park, just past the tree line, a figure stood motionless. I couldn't make out the details. It was too far away, just a shadow in the dim light. But I knew it. I knew it from the twisted way it loomed, the way it made everything else around it seem insignificant, like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. The figure didn't move. I stood frozen, staring at it, my mind refusing to believe what my eyes were showing me. It couldn't be. I had escaped. I had gotten away. And yet, it was here. The figure started to move, slowly at first, dragging itself forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. My body went rigid, terror flooding my veins. I couldn't breathe. I turned and ran again, faster this time, my feet pounding the pavement, my mind screaming at me to keep going. The sound of scraping followed me, getting closer with every step. It was coming for me. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. but I knew it would never stop until it had me. I reached the main road, my legs aching, my chest on fire. I looked around for any sign of help, any sign of life, but there was nothing. Just the dim glow of the streetlights and the sound of my own frantic breath. Suddenly, there was a sound, a loud bang. I whipped my head around, expecting to see something coming for me, but there was only a car parked at the curb, its door swinging open in the wind. The banging noise came again, and this time I saw the door slowly creak shut, as if something had pushed it. My heart skipped a beat. It was there. I didn't wait to see what was going to happen next. I just ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I didn't care if I had no plan, no destination. I just needed to get away. But as I ran, something strange began to happen. The world around me felt like it was warping. The streetlights flickered more violently, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting. I stumbled, trying to keep my balance, but everything was spinning, everything was wrong. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The apartment. The building loomed in front of me like a dark, oppressive figure, its windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I could feel it, the pull, the unnatural draw, the sense that I was being called back. I couldn't stop myself. My legs moved of their own accord, my feet carrying me toward the very thing I had fled from. No matter how hard I tried to fight it, I was drawn back in. And then, I saw the door. The door to my apartment, wide open, beckoning me inside. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be near it. But my legs were moving again, faster now, toward the door that wasn't just part of the building, it was part of something much worse. I crossed the threshold without even realizing it. The moment my foot stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. The lights flickered, and the floor beneath me trembled. I could hear the scraping again, growing louder, closer. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mind screaming, but my body felt numb, as if I was no longer in control. The apartment was still the same. Or was it? The air felt colder now, heavier. The prints on the floor had changed again, no longer just faint outlines on the ceiling. They had moved, following the path I'd taken when I fled. They were all around me now, on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling. And in the center of the room, the figure stood waiting. Its smile, stretched too wide to be real, grew even larger, impossibly so. The air was thick with it. And I was trapped. I stood frozen in place, my pulse racing, my breath shallow and ragged. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its grotesque smile widening as though it were savoring the moment. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't. My legs felt as if they were glued to the floor, and my body refused to obey the desperate commands of my mind. I looked around frantically, trying to find any possible way out. The windows were shut tight, their glass fogged over with condensation. The door, the one I had entered through, was no longer there. Just the empty wall. The apartment was shrinking around me, closing in, suffocating me. The scraping sound was back, louder now, echoing through the apartment like nails on a chalkboard. It was coming from everywhere, the ceiling, the floor, the walls. It was as if the very air itself was scraping at the edges of my sanity. I turned back to the figure, but it hadn't moved an inch. The only thing that had changed was the way its eyes glowed, faintly at first, then brighter, like two small, burning coals. It knew I was there. It knew I was terrified. and I could feel it, the pull. Something inside me was tugging me toward it, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. My body trembled, resisting the urge to move forward, but it was no use. My feet began to move on their own, the floor beneath me giving way to something darker, deeper. I couldn't stop myself. Every step I took brought me closer to the figure. The smile widened even further, a sickening stretch that seemed to pierce through the fabric of reality itself. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating the air around me. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, low and guttural, as though the very walls of the apartment were groaning under its weight. The sound reverberated through my bones, rattling my very soul. It wasn't asking me to come closer. It wasn't even asking at all. It was commanding me. I had no choice but to obey. I stepped closer, my mind screaming for me to stop, to fight, to run. But I couldn't. I was being pulled, not just by the figure, but by something far worse, the realization that there was no escape. There never had been. The closer I got, the more I could see. The details of the figure were becoming clearer now. Its skin, or what I thought was skin, was a pale, mottled gray, like something that had been buried for far too long. Its eyes were too bright, too intense. They glowed with an unnatural hunger, an emptiness that promised only one thing: it wanted me. I was its prey, and there was no escape. I reached out, my hand trembling, as if it had a mind of its own. The figure's smile twisted, its lips curling back further to reveal a set of teeth that were not teeth at all. They were jagged, uneven shards of bone, sharp and gleaming like the remnants of some ancient creature. The moment my fingers brushed against its cold, hard surface, the world shattered. The apartment, the walls, the floor, they all dissolved into a dark, endless void. The air grew thick and oppressive, suffocating. The figure was no longer just standing there, it was everywhere, its presence consuming everything around me, pulling me deeper into its void. I couldn't scream. My voice was gone, lost in the vast emptiness that surrounded me. The figure's smile remained, even as everything else disappeared, growing wider, larger, until it was the only thing I could see. It was a smile that promised only one thing: nothing. I was alone. Alone in the dark. Alone with the thing that had been waiting for me all along. And then, in the farthest corner of my mind, a single thought emerged. This was it. There was no escaping it. And the last thing I saw before everything went black was that smile. Wide. Hungry. Waiting. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.